I've driven Highway 1 between San Francisco and Half Moon Bay for work every week for 5 years. And there's a hitchhiker who appears at the same mile marker every single time, no matter what day or time I pass, and I'm starting to think she's not waiting for a ride, but for something else entirely. I work as a sales rep for a tech company in the city, and my territory includes accounts down the coast, which means I make the drive at least once a week, sometimes more. It's a beautiful route when the weather's good, dramatic coastline, crashing waves, that iconic California scenery that looks like it belongs on postcards. The first time I saw her was in early spring, about 5 years ago. It was a Tuesday morning, around 9 a.m., and I was heading south toward Half Moon Bay for a client meeting. Just past mile marker 32, I saw a woman standing on the shoulder in a bright yellow raincoat, thumb out in the classic hitchhiker pose. It was a clear day, no rain, so the raincoat seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it. Lots of people hitchhike along Highway 1, and I've never been comfortable picking up strangers, so I drove past. The second time I saw her was the following week, Thursday afternoon on my way back north. Same spot, same yellow raincoat, same outstretched thumb. I remember thinking it was a coincidence, maybe the same person whose car had broken down again, though that seemed unlikely. But coastal California has a lot of transient populations, hitchhikers who travel the same routes regularly, so I dismissed it. By the time I'd seen her a dozen times over the next few months, I started to feel uneasy. It was always the exact same spot. I checked my odometer and GPS, and it was consistently mile marker 32.7, right where the highway curves along a particularly steep section of coastline. Always the same yellow raincoat, always the same pose. I started paying closer attention to details. The raincoat was bright yellow, the kind that's meant to be highly visible, with a hood that was always up, shadowing her face. She stood perfectly still except for her raised arm, thumb extended toward northbound traffic. I varied my schedule to test it. I drove past at 6 a.m. on a Monday, she was there. Midnight on a Saturday, she was there, visible in my headlights, same yellow raincoat glowing in the darkness. Summer afternoons, winter mornings, weekdays, and weekends, it didn't matter. Every single time I drove that stretch of Highway 1, she was at mile marker 32.7, in the exact same position, wearing the exact same raincoat. I started asking other drivers who regularly traveled that route. I'd stop at the gas station in Half Moon Bay, the coffee shop in Pacifica, striking up conversations with anyone who looked like they commuted regularly. The responses were split. About half the people I talked to had no idea what I was talking about, claimed they'd never seen any hitchhiker at that location. But the other half knew exactly who I meant. "The woman in the yellow raincoat," one trucker said, nodding immediately. "She's always there, been seeing her for years." I collected stories from about a dozen people who'd seen her. All of them described the same details: yellow raincoat, mile marker, 32.7, never moves except to hold out her thumb, never shows her face clearly because of the hood. One woman said she'd been seeing her for 8 years. A delivery driver said he'd seen her almost daily for 3 years. None of them had ever stopped to pick her up. Something about her absolute consistency felt wrong, they said. Something about the way she never moved, never turned her head to watch approaching cars, never showed any reaction when vehicles passed without stopping. I became obsessed with understanding what I was seeing. I started documenting every time I passed that spot, taking photos when I could safely do so while driving, noting the time and weather conditions. I accumulated hundreds of observations over the course of 2 years. The data was consistent. She appeared every single time, regardless of conditions, always in the exact same position. I researched the history of that section of Highway 1, looking for accidents or incidents that might explain a haunting or some kind of residual phenomenon. What I found was both expected and disturbing. In November 1987, a woman named Patricia Vickers was killed by a hit-and-run driver at mile marker 32.7. According to the police report, she'd been hitchhiking in a yellow raincoat. The driver who hit her was never identified. Patricia's body was found on the shoulder the next morning by a passing motorist. She'd been 23 years old, traveling down the coast, trying to get to Los Angeles. I thought that explained it: Patricia's ghost, trapped at the location of her death, endlessly attempting to hitchhike, repeating the last thing she'd been doing before she died. It fit the classic pattern of residual hauntings, The idea that traumatic events can somehow be recorded in the environment and played back like a recording. But the more I observed her, the less convinced I became that I was seeing a ghost. Ghosts, according to most accounts, are at least somewhat reactive to the environment. They appear and disappear, they show some awareness of the living, they vary in their behavior. But the woman in the yellow raincoat never varied. She was always in exactly the same position, always making exactly the same gesture. It was too consistent, too mechanical, too much like watching a video loop, rather than witnessing any kind of conscious presence. I started thinking about it differently. What if it wasn't a ghost, but something more like a recording? What if Patricia's death had somehow created a permanent impression in that location, a moment frozen and replayed continuously, visible to some people but not others? What if the reason I saw her every time while others never saw her at all was related to some kind of perceptual difference, some sensitivity to whatever phenomenon was creating the loop? I wanted to test this theory, but I was afraid of what might happen if I stopped to interact with her. Every instinct told me that picking her up would be a terrible mistake, that engaging with the loop might pull me into it somehow. But I also needed to understand what was happening, needed to know if she was aware, if there was anything I could do to help her, if she was somehow trapped. I decided to approach cautiously. One Tuesday morning, I pulled over about 100 yards before mile marker 32.7, got out of my car, and walked toward her position. As I got closer, I could see her more clearly. The yellow raincoat was old-fashioned, the style popular in the 1980s. Her jeans were faded, her shoes worn. Her right arm was extended, thumb out, and she stood perfectly still, staring ahead at the road. I called out to her from about 20 feet away. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I moved closer, now about 10 feet away, close enough to see that her hood shadowed her face completely, making it impossible to see her features. I reached out toward her, intending to touch her shoulder, to see if she was somehow solid, or if my hand would pass through her. But as my hand approached, I felt resistance, not physical, but a pressure in the air, a sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl and my heart race. I pulled back, suddenly terrified of what might happen if I made contact. I backed away to my car, hands shaking. As I drove past her, I looked in my rearview mirror. She was still there, still in the same position, as if I'd never approached at all. Over the next few months, I tried different approaches. I brought a camera with a long lens, photographing her from a distance. In the photos, she appeared exactly as I saw her, with my eyes yellow raincoat, extended arm, shadowed face. But the photos had a strange quality, a slight blur or distortion around her figure, as if she wasn't quite in focus, even when everything around her was sharp. I tried recording video as I drove past. The video showed the same thing, a woman in a yellow raincoat, standing at the roadside, thumb out. But when I played it back frame by frame, I noticed something disturbing. She didn't move at all. Not even the tiny movements you'd expect from a living person, no swaying, no breathing, no shifting of weight. She was absolutely static, like a mannequin. I brought other people with me on drives. Some of them saw her, some didn't. Those who did see her confirmed all the details I'd observed. Those who didn't see her looked at me like I was crazy when I pointed out her location, insisting there was nothing there. I started researching quantum physics, parallel universes, anything that might explain a phenomenon where reality seemed to be looping or layering in a specific location. I found theories about closed time-like curves, about how certain conditions might create situations where time loops back on itself. I found accounts of other locations where people reported seeing the same scene played out repeatedly, usually associated with traumatic deaths or intense emotional events. The theory I kept coming back to was that Patricia's death had created a kind of temporal scar, a place where the moment of her hitchhiking had become permanently embedded in that location. Not a ghost with consciousness or awareness, but a recording, a loop that played continuously for those who were somehow attuned to perceive it. But if that was true, what would happen if someone stopped to pick her up? Would they somehow step into the loop? Would they become part of the recording, trapped in a moment that repeated endlessly? I found one account that disturbed me deeply. In an old forum post from 2003, someone described seeing a woman in a yellow raincoat hitchhiking on Highway 1. They'd stopped to pick her up. According to their post, When they pulled over and opened the passenger door, the woman got in. But as soon as the door closed, they found themselves back on the highway, approaching mile marker 32.7 again, the woman still standing on the shoulder. They'd looped back somehow, returned to the moment before they stopped. They'd tried to drive past without stopping, but found themselves compelled to pull over again, to open the door again, to experience the same loop again. The post ended abruptly, with the person saying they were going to try to break the loop by taking a different route home. I tried to find that person, to see if they'd ever escaped the loop or if they were still trapped in it. But the forum had been defunct for years, and I had no way to track down the user. The account disappeared into the digital void, leaving only that terrifying description of being caught in a repeating moment. I became more careful after reading that. I never pulled over near mile marker 32.7 again. I made sure to maintain speed when passing that section, even when I saw her standing there, even when some part of me felt an irrational pull to stop, to offer help, to engage with the loop. But I started noticing changes in myself. I'd been driving past her for 5 years now, seeing her hundreds of times, and I realized I was thinking about her constantly. Even when I wasn't on Highway 1, I'd find myself visualizing that section of road, seeing the yellow raincoat in my mind, feeling the pull to go back, to drive past again, to see if she was still there. I tried taking different routes to my accounts down the coast. I'd drive Highway 280 to Highway 92, avoiding Highway 1 entirely. But I'd feel anxious the whole drive, distracted, thinking about mile marker 32.7, wondering if she was there even though I wasn't passing by to see her. The anxiety would build until I couldn't stand it, and I'd find myself taking Highway 1 on the return trip, just to confirm she was still there, just to see the yellow raincoat and feel the strange comfort of that absolute consistency. I realized I was developing a compulsion, a need to see her, to verify her presence. I started driving Highway 1 even when I didn't have accounts to visit, making excuses to take that route, checking mile marker 32.7 multiple times a week. She was always there, always in the same position, always in that yellow raincoat. I talked to a therapist about it, describing my obsession without mentioning the supernatural aspects. She suggested I might be experiencing a form of OCD, compulsive checking behaviors driven by anxiety. She recommended I stop driving Highway 1 entirely, break the pattern, find different routes to my accounts. I tried to follow her advice, managed to avoid that stretch of highway for almost 3 weeks. But the compulsion grew worse. I'd wake up thinking about mile marker 32.7, wondering if she was still there, if the loop was still playing. I'd check news reports for accidents on Highway 1, searching for any indication that something had changed, that the phenomenon had ended. I became irritable, distracted, unable to focus on work or anything else. Finally, I gave in and drove Highway 1 again. When I reached mile marker 32.7 and saw her there, yellow raincoat, extended thumb, same position, I felt a wave of relief so intense it scared me. I was relieved to see a phenomenon that terrified me, comforted by the presence of something I knew was wrong and possibly dangerous. That's when I realized the loop might be affecting me, even though I'd never stopped to pick her up. Just observing it repeatedly, just being exposed to that temporal scar or recording or whatever it was, might be creating a connection, pulling me gradually into its orbit. I'm writing this as a warning, but also as documentation. I've driven past the woman in the yellow raincoat at mile marker 32.7 on Highway 1 between San Francisco and Half Moon Bay over 400 times in 5 years. She's always there, always in the same position, always wearing that bright yellow raincoat. I believe she's a loop, a recording of Patricia Vickers from the moment before she was killed in 1987. I believe the loop is visible to some people and not to others for reasons I don't understand. And I believe the loop is designed to catch people, to pull them in, to add them to whatever temporal anomaly exists at that location. I think if you stop to pick her up, you become part of the loop, trapped in a repeating moment that never ends. But I also think that just observing the loop repeatedly creates a connection, a pull that gets stronger over time. I still drive Highway 1. I still see her at mile marker 32.7 every time I pass. And each time, the compulsion to stop gets slightly stronger. The pull to engage with the loop becomes slightly harder to resist. I don't know how long I can keep driving past, how many more times I can see her before the compulsion becomes irresistible. If you drive Highway 1 between San Francisco and Half Moon Bay, and you see a woman in a yellow raincoat hitchhiking at mile marker 32.7, don't stop, don't engage. Don't let yourself become fascinated by her consistency, because the loop is patient, and it's always waiting, and I think eventually it catches everyone who sees it too many times. She's still there right now. I know she is, even though I'm miles away, even though I'm not driving Highway 1 today. She's standing at mile marker 32.7 inches, her yellow raincoat, thumb extended, waiting, always waiting. And part of me is already planning when I'll drive past again, when I'll see her again, when I'll feel that terrible comfort of her absolute, unchanging presence. The loop is still playing, and I'm becoming part of it, whether I stop to pick her up or not. There's a metro station in downtown Los Angeles that appears on old transit maps from the 1990s, but isn't on any current maps, and I've been inside it, and I don't think it was ever meant for passengers from our version of Los Angeles. I'm a graduate student in urban planning at UCLA, and my thesis focuses on abandoned and failed infrastructure projects in major American cities. Los Angeles has dozens of these tunnels that were started and never finished, stations that were planned but never built, entire subway lines that existed only in proposals. The city's transit history is full of false starts and abandoned dreams, which makes it perfect for the kind of research I'm doing. I found the first reference to Pershing Square Lower while digitizing old metro maps in the Los Angeles Public Library's archives. It appeared on official transit maps from 1993 to 1997, shown as a station, 3 levels below the existing Pershing Square station. The maps indicated it was part of an expansion project, connected to the Red Line but serving a different purpose. The documentation was vague about what that purpose was. After 1997, it simply disappeared from all official maps and planning documents, as if it had never existed. I tried to find construction records, planning documents, anything that would explain what Pershing Square Lower had been intended for and why it had been abandoned. I contacted the Metro's historical archives, spoke with urban historians who specialized in Los Angeles infrastructure, even tracked down retired transit engineers who'd worked on Red Line expansion projects in the 1990s. Nobody had any clear information. A few people vaguely remembered hearing about a lower level at Pershing Square, but they all said it had been canceled before construction began, that it had never been more than a proposal. But the maps showed it as completed, not planned, not under construction, but finished and operational, at least on paper. That discrepancy bothered me enough that I decided to investigate whether any physical evidence of the station remained. The current Pershing Square station is one of the busier stops on the red and purple lines, located in the heart of downtown LA. I started visiting it regularly, mapping the layout, looking for any indication of additional levels below the existing platforms. I studied the station's construction diagrams, noting ventilation shafts and maintenance access points that might lead to lower levels. After 3 weeks of observation and planning, I found what I was looking for: a maintenance access door in a service corridor that transit workers used, but that was rarely monitored by security. I waited until late on a weeknight, when passenger traffic was minimal, dressed in clothing that could pass for a maintenance worker's outfit at a distance, and slipped through the door when no one was watching. The corridor beyond led to a steep metal staircase descending into darkness. I'd brought a powerful flashlight, and I used it to navigate down 3 flights of stairs, going much deeper than the existing station platforms. The air grew noticeably cooler and more stale as I descended, and I could hear the distant rumble of trains from the active lines above, the sound muffled and distorted by layers of concrete and earth. At the bottom of the 3rd flight, I found myself in a maintenance tunnel that looked like it hadn't been accessed in years. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. The walls showed water staining and minor deterioration, but the construction was solid, professional, clearly part of the metro system's infrastructure. I followed the tunnel for about 200 feet, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, until I reached a doorway that opened into what I immediately recognized as a subway platform. Pershing Square Lower was real, not planned, not canceled, but actually built a fully constructed station, 3 levels below the current Pershing Square stop, exactly as the old maps had indicated. I stood on the platform and slowly panned my flashlight across the space, taking in details that made my skin crawl with unease. The platform was finished to the same standard as any operational metro station, The walls were covered in tile work, geometric patterns in colors that were popular in 1990s institutional design. Bench seating lined the walls, the same molded plastic benches used throughout the metro system. Electrical fixtures were mounted on the ceiling, currently dark but looking functional. Even the signage was in place, backlit panels showing Pershing Square Lower in the metro's standard font and design. But everything was wrong in subtle ways that became more disturbing the longer I looked. The advertisements mounted in the station's display cases were for products I'd never heard of, soft drinks with unfamiliar brand names, movies that had never been made featuring actors I didn't recognize, events for dates that had passed decades ago but that I had no memory of ever happening. One advertisement promoted a concert at the Hollywood Bowl featuring a musician whose name meant nothing to me, dated for the 15th of July, 1995. I checked later, there had been a concert at the Hollywood Bowl on that date, but it had featured a completely different performer. The tile work was even more unsettling. Throughout the metro system, stations featured decorative tiles showing scenes from local history and culture. Pershing Square Lower had similar tiles, but they depicted events that didn't match Los Angeles history as I knew it. One panel showed what appeared to be the 1984 Olympics, but the stadium was wrong, the architecture different from the LA Memorial Coliseum. Another showed the Hollywood sign, but with different lettering, the hills behind it, shaped slightly wrong. The benches were positioned facing away from the tracks, or rather, away from where tracks should be. In a normal station, seating faces the platform edge so passengers can watch for approaching trains. Here, all the benches face the back wall, as if the people who built this station expected passengers to wait with their backs to the trains. I walked to the platform edge and looked down at the track bed. There were no tracks. The space where rails should have been laid was empty, just concrete bedding and the standard spacing for metro gauge tracks, but no actual rails. The tunnel extended in both directions into darkness, properly excavated and finished, but completely empty of the infrastructure needed to actually run trains. I spent over an hour on that first visit, photographing everything, taking measurements, trying to understand what I was seeing. The station was professionally constructed, built to metro standards, clearly part of an official project. But it had been built wrong, or built for a purpose I couldn't understand, and then abandoned and erased from official records as completely as possible. I went back 3 more times over the following month, each time spending longer in the station, documenting more details, trying to piece together what had happened here. On my second visit, I brought a better camera and took hundreds of photos. On my third visit, I brought surveying equipment and created detailed measurements of the station's dimensions and layout. On my fourth visit, I brought a Geiger counter and an EMF detector, thinking maybe there was some kind of environmental contamination or electromagnetic anomaly that had caused the station to be abandoned. All the tests came back normal. No radiation, no unusual electromagnetic fields, nothing that would explain why this fully constructed station had been built and then sealed off and removed from all official documentation. But on that fourth visit, something happened that made me understand this station was more than just an abandoned infrastructure project. I was on the platform, photographing the tile work, when I heard a sound in the distance, a low rumble, growing louder, the unmistakable sound of an approaching train. I could feel it through the floor, the vibration of something heavy, moving through the tunnel, getting closer. I froze, my rational mind insisting that this was impossible. There were no tracks. There was no power supply to the tunnel. There was no way a train could be approaching. But the sound continued to grow louder, and I could feel wind beginning to blow through the tunnel, the pressure wave that precedes a train in a confined space. I backed away from the platform edge, my heart pounding, torn between scientific curiosity and survival instinct. The wind grew stronger, carrying with it a smell I couldn't identify, something like ozone mixed with something organic and unpleasant. The rumbling reached a crescendo, and I could see lights in the tunnel, the glow of a train's headlights approaching the station. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I didn't wait to see what emerged from that tunnel. I turned and ran back toward the maintenance access, taking the stairs 2 at a time, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I climbed. Behind me, I could hear the train entering the station, the sound of it braking, the hiss of doors opening. I didn't look back. I reached the maintenance corridor and kept running until I emerged into the service area of the regular Pershing Square station, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe it was a maintenance train, some kind of vehicle that Metro used to inspect tunnels, running on temporary tracks I hadn't seen. Maybe the vibration I'd felt was from trains on the active lines above, transmitted through the structure in ways that made it seem like it was coming from the lower level. Maybe I'd panicked and imagined the lights and the wind and the sound of doors opening. But I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd felt. Something had arrived at that station, something that used tunnels without tracks and operated in a space that officially didn't exist. I went back to the library and looked more carefully at the maps from 1993 to 1997. I noticed something I'd missed before the routes shown connecting to Pershing Square. Lower didn't quite match the actual red line alignment. They diverged slightly, running at angles that didn't correspond to any of the metro tunnels I knew existed. It was like the maps were showing a transit system that was almost but not quite the real Los Angeles Metro, a version that existed parallel to the actual infrastructure but separate from it. I found one more piece of information that disturbed me deeply. In 1994, during the construction of the Red Line expansion, 7 workers had disappeared from a work site near Pershing Square. The official explanation was that they'd abandoned the job, left Los Angeles, possibly returned to Mexico where several of them had family. But their disappearance had never been satisfactorily explained, and families had filed missing persons reports that were never resolved. The work site where they disappeared was located approximately where I calculated the entrance to Pershing Square Lower would be, based on the station's position relative to the upper levels. I think I know what happened to those workers. I think they found the lower level, or maybe they were building it, and something about that space pulled them in, took them somewhere else. Somewhere that looks like Los Angeles but isn't quite right, where products and movies and events don't match our history, where the geography is slightly wrong and the Olympics happened in a different stadium. I think Pershing Square Lower isn't an abandoned station. I think it's a threshold, a connection point to a version of Los Angeles that exists adjacent to ours but separate from it. And I think the trains that run through those tunnels without tracks aren't carrying passengers from our Los Angeles, they're carrying passengers from that other version, moving through their city the same way our metro moves through ours. And sometimes the two systems intersect, overlap, create spaces like Pershing Square Lower, where the boundaries blur. I haven't been back to the station since that 4th visit. I'm writing my thesis about it, documenting everything I found, but I'm being careful not to include too many specifics about the location or access methods. I don't want others to find it, don't want to encourage people to explore a space that might pull them into a version of reality where they don't belong. But I think about it constantly. I think about those workers who disappeared, about whether they're still alive in that other Los Angeles, whether they adapted to a city that's almost like home but fundamentally wrong in ways they could never quite articulate. I think about the train I heard arriving at a station with no tracks, about what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd been standing on the platform when those doors opened. I think about the advertisements for products that don't exist and events that never happened, and I wonder if they're not fictional but real in that other version of the city, if somewhere there's a Los Angeles where those soft drinks are sold, and those movies were made and those concerts happened exactly as the posters advertised. And I think about the fact that Pershing Square Lower appeared on official metro maps for 4 years before being removed from all documentation. I think someone in the planning department knew about it, knew what it was, and made the decision to erase it from the public record, to seal it off and pretend it had never existed. I think that person understood that some infrastructure projects connect places that shouldn't be connected, and that the smart thing to do is close the connection and forget it was ever there. The station is still there, 3 levels below Pershing Square, waiting in the darkness. The tiles still show a version of Los Angeles history that doesn't quite match ours. The benches still face away from tracks that don't exist. And sometimes, if you're deep enough in the metro system late at night, if you're in one of the maintenance tunnels or service corridors where the public doesn't go, you can hear the rumble of a train moving through tunnels that aren't on any map, carrying passengers to and from stations that officially don't exist, running routes through a city that's almost Los Angeles, but not quite. I won't go back to Pershing Square Lower, but I know it's there, and I know the trains still run through those impossible tunnels, and I know that somewhere in the Los Angeles metro system, there are thresholds to places we're not supposed to go, connections to versions of our city that exist in the spaces between what is and what might have been. And I know that 7 workers disappeared while building it, and I don't think they're coming back. In San Francisco's Alamo Square, there's a Victorian house that appears in photographs from different decades, looking exactly the same while all the houses around it change, and I've started to suspect it exists outside of normal time, and I think the people inside it are trapped there forever. I work as a digital archivist for the San Francisco Historical Society, which means I spend my days scanning and cataloging thousands of historical photographs, organizing them by date and location, making them accessible for researchers and the public. It's meticulous work that requires attention to detail, and over the past 3 years, I've digitized probably 50,000 images of San Francisco from the 1850s through the present day. I first noticed the house on Steiner Street while processing a collection of photographs from the 1906 earthquake. Alamo Square is one of San Francisco's most photographed locations, famous for the painted ladies, those iconic Victorian houses that appear on postcards and in movies. The Historical Society has hundreds of images of that area from different time periods, documenting how the neighborhood has changed over more than a century. The 1906 photographs showed the devastation from the earthquake and subsequent fires. Most of Alamo Square had been damaged or destroyed, with several of the Victorian houses reduced to rubble or gutted by fire. But one house, a 3-story Victorian painted in shades of blue and cream, located on the west side of the square, stood completely intact, not just standing, but pristine, as if the earthquake and fires had never touched it. Every window was whole, the paint looked fresh, even the decorative gingerbread trim appeared undamaged, while houses on either side showed various stages of destruction. I didn't think much of it at first. Some buildings had survived the earthquake through luck or superior construction, but over the following weeks, as I processed photographs from different decades, I kept seeing that same house, and I started to notice something disturbing about it. In photographs from the 1920s, the house looked identical to how it had appeared in 1906. Same paint colors, same trim, same curtains visible in the windows, while every other house on the block showed the normal signs of aging and maintenance, repainting, repairs, modifications. This house looked exactly the same. In 1950s photographs, neighbors' houses showed the architectural updates typical of that era. Some had been modernized, others showed decades of weather exposure and wear. But the house on Steiner Street looked freshly painted in the exact same colors it had worn in 1906, with the same curtains, the same flower boxes in the windows containing what appeared to be the same flowers. I pulled images from the 1980s. By then, most of the Victorian houses in Alamo Square had been restored as part of San Francisco's historic preservation efforts. They looked beautiful but clearly maintained, showing the evidence of renovation and care. The house on Steiner Street looked identical to how it had appeared in every previous photograph. Same paint, same trim, same curtains, same flowers. Not just similar, but photographically identical, as if someone had copied and pasted the same house into images taken 80 years apart. I became obsessed with documenting this anomaly. I created a timeline of photographs showing the house from 1906 to the present day, laying them out side by side on my computer screen. The house never changed. Paint that should have faded and peeled remained perfect. Wood that should have weathered and warped stayed pristine. Decorative elements that should have deteriorated or been replaced remained exactly the same. I started visiting Alamo Square regularly, photographing the house myself, comparing my images to the historical photographs. The house was still there, still looking exactly as it had in every photograph for over a century. I walked around it, examining it from every angle. The paint was perfect, no fading, no chips, no signs of age. The windows were clean, the glass old but flawless. The garden was maintained, but never varied, the same plants in the same positions, blooming in the same pattern regardless of season. I took photographs from the exact same angles as some of the historical images. When I overlaid my photos with ones from 50, 70, 100 years ago, they matched perfectly, not approximately perfectly. Every detail identical, as if no time had passed at all. Then I noticed the people. In several of the historical photographs, faces were visible in the windows, residents looking out, captured incidentally while photographers were documenting the street or the square. In a 1928 photograph, a woman stood in a second-floor window, her face partially visible, wearing what looked like a white blouse. In a 1955 photograph, the same woman appeared in the same window, wearing what appeared to be the same white blouse, in the exact same position. I found more examples. A man visible in a first-floor window in photographs from 1932 and 1968, apparently unchanged, wearing the same dark suit in both images. A child's face in an attic window in photos from 1941 and 1979, the same child, the same age, the same expression. I started taking my own photographs specifically to capture the windows, using a long lens to photograph the house at different times of day, different days of the week. The people were still there. The woman in the white blouse in the second-floor window, the man in the dark suit on the first floor, the child in the attic, always in the same positions, wearing the same clothing, their faces showing the same expressions. I tried to research who lived in the house. Property records showed it had been owned by different people over the decades, a family named Ashworth in the 1920s, someone named Margaret Chen in the 1950s, a couple named the Richardsons in the 1980s. But I couldn't find any records of these people outside of the property ownership. No death certificates, no records of them selling the house or moving away, no census data, no public records of any kind except the property deeds. They appeared in the records long enough to be listed as owners, and then they simply vanished from all documentation, as if they'd never existed beyond their connection to that house. But the house remained occupied, lights visible in windows at night, movement occasionally seen through the curtains, those same faces appearing in the same windows decade after decade. I contacted previous researchers who had worked with the Historical Society's photograph collection, asking if anyone had noticed the house. One elderly researcher, a man named Dr. Robert Chen, who'd worked at the Society in the 1970s, agreed to meet with me. When I showed him the photographs and explained what I'd found, he was quiet for a long time. "I noticed it too," he finally said. 40 years ago, I was cataloging photographs from the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, and that house appeared in several images. I compared them to more recent photos and saw the same thing. You're seeing no changes, no aging, the same impossible consistency. I tried to investigate, but he paused, looking uncomfortable. I went to the house. I knocked on the door. A woman answered. She looked to be in her 30s, wearing an old-fashioned white blouse. She invited me in. He refused to tell me what he'd seen inside, but he warned me not to enter the house, not to knock on the door, not to try to make contact with whoever or whatever was inside. "The house exists," he said. "The people inside exist, but they exist in a way that doesn't follow normal time. If you go inside, you might not be able to leave. Or you might leave, but you won't be the same. You'll be like them, stuck." I tried to get more information from him, but he refused to discuss it further. He did tell me one more thing before he left. His sister, Margaret, had owned the house in the 1950s. She'd bought it in 1952, lived there for 3 years, and then vanished from all public records in 1955. He'd been searching for answers about what happened to her ever since. I realized Dr. Chen's last name was the same as Margaret Chen, the 1950s owner I'd found in property records. His sister had disappeared into that house 70 years ago, and he'd spent his entire life trying to understand what had happened to her. I became more cautious, but more determined. I started documenting the house more systematically, photographing it at the same time every day, creating a detailed record of any changes or variations. There were none. The house remained absolutely consistent, frozen in some perpetual state that didn't acknowledge the passage of time. I researched the history of the property, looking for when the house had been built and whether anything unusual had happened at that location. Records showed the house had been constructed in 1897 by a wealthy merchant who'd made his fortune in shipping. He'd lived there for 9 years and then disappeared in 1906, not during the earthquake, but 3 months before it. In February of that year, his disappearance was noted in contemporary newspaper accounts as mysterious and unexplained. The house had passed to distant relatives who tried to sell it but couldn't find buyers, despite its prime location and beautiful architecture. Over the next century, the house had changed hands multiple times, always staying on the market for only brief periods before being purchased, then being listed again a few years later. But I couldn't find records of any of the supposed owners actually living there beyond those initial few years. They bought the house, presumably moved in, and then simply stopped existing in public records, while the house remained occupied by the same unchanging faces in the same windows. I think the house is a trap, a place where time doesn't flow normally, where people who enter become frozen in the moment they arrived. I think the woman in the white blouse, the man in the dark suit, the child in the attic, I think they're all people who moved into that house at different points over the past century, and they're all still there, trapped in the specific moment when they became permanent residents, unable to age or change or leave. I think Dr. Chen's sister Margaret is the woman in the white blouse. I think she bought the house in 1952, moved in wearing that white blouse one day in 1955, and became trapped in that moment, standing in that second-floor window forever, visible in photographs from that day forward, never aging, never moving on. I decided I needed to see inside the house, but I was terrified of Dr. Chen's warning about not being able to leave. I started watching the house at different times, looking for any opportunity to see the interior without actually entering. One evening, I positioned myself across the street with a camera and telephoto lens, and I managed to photograph through a first-floor window. The interior looked like a perfectly preserved Victorian home from the late 1890s. Period-appropriate furniture, gas light fixtures, decorative elements from that era. But everything looked new, as if the house had been furnished yesterday with authentic period pieces in pristine condition. And I could see people inside, multiple people, maybe a dozen, all dressed in clothing from different eras, all moving through the rooms in slow, purposeful ways, like actors in a play performing the same scene over and over. I recognized some of the faces from the windows. The woman in the white blouse walked from one room to another, her movements smooth and deliberate. The man in the dark suit sat in a chair reading a newspaper. The child climbed stairs toward the attic. And there were others, people I hadn't seen in the windows, but who appeared in the interior, all moving through their routines, all trapped in whatever moment had frozen them in that house. I've stopped visiting Alamo Square. I've documented everything I found, compiled all the photographs, written detailed notes about the house's history and the impossible consistency of its appearance. But I'm not going to publish this research, not going to draw attention to the house, not going to encourage anyone else to investigate, because I think the house is still looking for new residents. I think it appears on the market periodically, attracts buyers with its pristine condition and historic charm, and then traps them in the moment they commit to living there, adding them to the collection of frozen people who perform their endless routines in rooms where time has stopped. I've started having dreams about the house. In the dreams, I'm walking up to the front door, and it opens before I can knock. Inside, all those people are waiting, standing in positions that form a pathway leading deeper into the house. They don't speak, don't acknowledge me, just stand there in their frozen moments. And I know if I walk past them, if I go deeper into the house, I'll find a place that's perfect for me, a moment that I'll occupy forever, a window where I'll stand looking out at a San Francisco that will change and grow and evolve, while I remain exactly the same, trapped in the house on Steiner Street that refuses to move forward through time. The house is still there, still perfect, still unchanged, still occupied by people who bought it decades ago and never left. And somewhere in its windows, Dr. Chen's sister Margaret still stands in her white blouse, frozen in 1955, visible in every photograph taken of that house from that day to this, waiting in a moment that will never end. I don't know if they're suffering, if they're aware of being trapped, or if they exist in some kind of peaceful stasis where time's passage simply doesn't apply. But I know I won't join them. I won't knock on that door, won't accept any invitation to enter, won't become another face in another window, frozen in whatever moment the house decides to keep me in. The house on Steiner Street doesn't age, doesn't change, doesn't move forward through time, and the people inside it don't either. They're there now, in their windows, in their rooms, performing their routines, trapped in a building that exists outside of the normal flow of years and decades and centuries. And they'll be there forever, or until the house decides to release them, which I don't think it ever will. Santa Monica Pier measures 1,600 feet from the beach to the end during the day, but at night after the crowds leave, it extends much further, and I've walked to the end of the extended pier twice, and I don't think the ocean it reaches into is the same Pacific Ocean that's there during daylight. I've worked as a maintenance technician for the pier for 8 months now, responsible for overnight inspections and minor repairs after the tourist crowds have gone home and the amusement park has shut down for the night. It's solitary work that pays better than day shifts, because most people don't want to work the graveyard hours, but I've never minded being alone. And I like the pier when it's quiet and empty, when I can hear the ocean without the noise of crowds and carnival music. My shift starts at midnight and runs until 6 a.m. I arrive just as the last visitors are leaving, as the ride operators are shutting down the Ferris wheel and the roller coaster, as the food vendors are closing their stalls and the arcade is going dark. By 12:30, I'm usually alone on the pier, except for the occasional security guard making rounds. My job is to walk the entire length of the structure, checking for damage, testing railings, looking for anything that needs repair or presents a safety hazard. I carry a tablet that logs my position and timing, a flashlight, and basic tools for minor fixes. The Santa Monica Pier is iconic. 1,600 feet of wooden planking extending into the Pacific, supporting an amusement park, an aquarium, restaurants, and shops. It's been there since 1909, rebuilt and renovated multiple times, a landmark that appears in countless movies and photographs. During the day, it's crowded and bright and full of life. At night, it's a different place entirely, dark and echoing, the ocean sounds amplified by the emptiness. I'd been doing the job for about 3 months when I first noticed something wrong with the pier's length. It was a Tuesday night in late October, unusually quiet even for a weeknight. I'd started my inspection at the beach end, as always, walking west toward the ocean, checking the support pillars that were accessible from the deck, testing the railings along the sides. The pier's length is consistent. I'd time my walks and it took me about 20 minutes to reach the end at a normal pace, allowing for stops to check various points. But that night, I walked for 20 minutes and still hadn't reached the end. I checked my watch, thinking I'd somehow lost track of time, but no, 22 minutes since I'd started walking, and the end of the pier wasn't visible yet. The lights from shore were getting more distant behind me, but ahead, the pier just kept extending into darkness. I pulled out my phone and checked the GPS. It showed me as being in the ocean, over a mile from shore, the blue dot floating in empty water. But I was standing on solid wooden planking, the pier structure unchanged, still walking on the same boards I'd been walking on for 3 months. I kept going, compelled by confusion and professional responsibility to reach the end and complete my inspection. The pier continued ahead of me, the wooden planks reflecting my flashlight beam, the railings on either side intact and normal. But the sounds were changing. The familiar crash of waves against the pier's supports sounded different, muffled, thicker, as if the water had more substance. The air smelled wrong too, still salt and ocean, but with an undertone of something else, something organic and old that I couldn't identify. After 30 minutes of walking, I finally saw structures ahead, dark shapes against the night sky. As I got closer, I realized they were buildings on the pier, additional carnival structures that I'd never seen before. There was a carousel, but not the brightly painted one that operated during the day. This was older, more ornate, the horses carved in styles I didn't recognize. There were vendor stalls, but selling items I couldn't identify in the darkness, signs advertising games I'd never heard of. Everything was abandoned, showing clear signs of age and weather exposure. The carousel horses were weathered and cracked, paint peeling in patterns that suggested decades of exposure. The vendor stalls were empty, their counters warped and split, but none of it matched anything from the Santa Monica Pier's history. I'd studied the pier's past as part of my training. I knew what attractions had been there over the decades, what the pier had looked like in different eras. These structures didn't match any historical period I was familiar with. I walked to what appeared to be the end of this extended section, a railing at the edge of the planking. Beyond it, the ocean stretched dark and featureless, but it didn't look like the Pacific Ocean I'd seen every night for 3 months. The water was darker, almost black, and it moved wrong, thick, viscous, waves forming and breaking in patterns that didn't match normal tidal action. And the horizon was wrong. During the day, you could see the curve of the earth, the distant line where ocean met sky. Here, the ocean seemed to extend forever, no horizon visible, just darkness continuing into more darkness. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the extended pier with the GPS, showing me far out in the ocean, trying to explain the strange water and the abandoned carnival structures. Then I heard something in the water below, not waves, but something moving, something large displacing water in a way that suggested intent and awareness. I backed away from the railing and started walking back toward shore. The return walk took the normal 20 minutes. Somehow, the pier had compressed back to its regular length, or I'd returned from wherever the extended section reached. When I emerged at the beach end, everything was normal. The pier was its usual 1,600 feet, the lights of Santa Monica visible and familiar behind me. I didn't report what I'd experienced. I told myself I'd gotten disoriented, that the darkness and solitude had played tricks on my perception, that I'd somehow miscounted time and distance. I completed the rest of my shift, doing other maintenance tasks, and went home at 6 a.m., tired and unsettled. But the next night and the night after, I paid careful attention during my pier walks. The length was normal, always 20 minutes to reach the end, 1,600 feet as documented and measured. My GPS showed my position accurately, the blue dot moving along the pier's path, reaching the end exactly where it should. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Same conditions late at night, quiet, minimal security presence. I started walking, and 25 minutes later, I still hadn't reached the end. The GPS showed me far out in the ocean. The lights from shore were distant points behind me, and ahead, the same abandoned carnival structures appeared. The weathered carousel, the empty vendor stalls, the strange attractions that didn't match any historical record. This time I explored more carefully, documenting everything with my phone's camera. I photographed the carousel horses with their unfamiliar carving styles, the vendor stalls with their mysterious signs, the structural details of buildings that shouldn't exist. I took video of the ocean beyond the end of the extended pier, capturing how wrong the water looked, how it moved in those thick, unnatural patterns. And I found something that made me understand this wasn't a hallucination or disorientation. In one of the abandoned buildings, tucked behind a counter, I found a journal. It was water-damaged and old, the pages brittle and yellowed, but still legible. The first entry was dated the 15th of March, 1963, written by someone named James Corrigan, who identified himself as a night maintenance worker for the Santa Monica Pier. His entries described the same phenomenon I'd experienced. The pier extending beyond its normal length after dark, reaching into an ocean that didn't look or feel like the Pacific, structures appearing that didn't match any historical period. He'd walked the extended pier multiple times, documented what he found, tried to understand what was happening. His final entries became increasingly disturbed. He wrote about seeing things in the dark water, shapes moving beneath the surface that were too large to be whales, too purposeful in their movements to be natural ocean life. He wrote about hearing sounds from the water at night, not the calls of sea lions or the crash of waves, but something else, something that sounded almost like voices calling from below. The last entry was dated the 3rd of June, 1963. James Corrigan wrote that he'd realized the pier wasn't just extending randomly, it was reaching towards something, stretching out into that wrong ocean to connect with something that wanted to be reached. He wrote that he'd decided to walk to the absolute end one more time, to see what was out there, to understand what the pier was trying to reach. There were no more entries after that. I looked up James Corrigan when I got home that morning. He'd disappeared in June 1963, vanished from his job without explanation, never found. The official assumption was that he'd fallen from the pier into the ocean and drowned, his body lost to the currents. But I don't think he fell. I think he walked to the end of the extended pier and found what it was reaching toward, and whatever he found didn't let him come back. I've walked the extended pier one more time since finding that journal 3 weeks ago. It happened on a foggy night when visibility was already limited. The pier extended even further. This time I walked for 40 minutes before reaching the abandoned carnival structures, and beyond them, the pier continued for another stretch, maybe another 1,000 feet, ending at a larger structure I hadn't seen before. It looked like a pavilion or bandstand, ornate Victorian architecture that seemed impossibly well preserved, despite the weathering on everything else. As I approached it, I could hear something music, faint and distant, coming from the direction of that dark ocean. Not modern music, not anything I recognized, but something older, stranger, played on instruments I couldn't identify. The water around the extended section was more active on this visit. I could see movement beneath the surface, large shapes circling the pier's supports, creating patterns in that thick, wrong water. And I could see lights far out in the ocean, not the lights of ships but something else, glowing from beneath the surface, pulsing in rhythms that matched the distant music. I walked to the pavilion and found more evidence of human presence. There were personal items scattered around modern items, not historical artifacts. A phone from the early 2000s, a backpack with someone's ID, a security guard who'd worked the pier in 2008 and had disappeared, presumed drowned, a maintenance worker's tool belt that looked recent, maybe from the last few years. People had been walking the extended pier for decades. Some of them, like me, had walked out and returned. Others, like James Corrigan, had walked out and never came back. I think the pier is inconsistent in what it allows. Sometimes it lets you explore and return. Sometimes it decides to keep you. I stood in that pavilion listening to the music from the ocean, watching the lights pulse beneath the surface, and I understood that the pier was offering a choice. I could walk to the absolute end, descend some stairs I could see leading down from the pavilion toward the water, and find out what was down there making that music and creating those lights. Or I could turn back, return to shore, and spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd refused to discover. I turned back. I walked for over an hour before reaching shore, the pier slowly compressing back to its normal length, the abandoned carnival structures fading into darkness behind me. When I emerged at the beach end, it was nearly 4 a.m., and I'd been gone for over 3 hours. But my GPS log showed a normal 20-minute walk to the end and back. I haven't told anyone about what I've experienced. I still work the night shift at the pier, still do my maintenance rounds. Most nights, the pier is its normal 1,600 feet, and I walk to the end and back in the expected time, checking structures and making repairs in the familiar territory of a landmark I know well. But some nights, maybe once or twice a month, always on the quietest nights, always when fog or darkness limits visibility, the pier extends. And when it does, I can choose whether to walk its length, to explore the abandoned carnival structures, to approach the pavilion where the music plays and the lights pulse in that wrong ocean. I haven't walked it again since that last time 3 weeks ago. I'm afraid that if I go out there one more time, I might not have the strength to turn back. I might descend those stairs from the pavilion, might walk down into that thick, dark water, might find out what's down there making the music and the lights. And I'm afraid that if I do, I'll become like James Corrigan, like the security guard from 2008, like all the others whose personal effects I found scattered in the abandoned carnival, people who walked the extended pier and never returned, people the ocean decided to keep. The pier is still there, still extending on those quiet nights when conditions are right, still reaching out into an ocean that isn't quite the Pacific, still stretching toward whatever is out there beneath the surface, still offering the choice to walk to the end and see what's waiting. I don't know if I'll walk it again, but I know it's there, and I know every night when I start my shift that this might be one of those nights when the pier extends, when 20 minutes of walking becomes 40 or 60, when abandoned carnival structures appear in the darkness, when the ocean beyond the end looks wrong and moves wrong and calls with music from beneath its surface. And I know that someday I might not turn back. Someday I might walk all the way to the end, descend those stairs, and find out what Santa Monica Pier has been reaching toward all these years, what it's been trying to connect with in that dark water where the Pacific Ocean becomes something else entirely. The journal I found from 1963 is in my apartment now. I've read James Corrigan's entries dozens of times, studying his observations, comparing them to my own experiences. And I've started my own journal, documenting each time the pier extends, each time I walk into that impossible distance, each time I choose to turn back. Because I think eventually the choice won't be mine anymore. I think the pier decides who walks back and who stays, and I think my time for deciding is running out. There's a fully constructed suburban neighborhood in South San Jose, streets, houses, landscaping, mailboxes that's been finished for 3 years, but has never been occupied, and when you walk through it, you realize it was never intended for human residence. I discovered Meadowbrook Estates while researching failed housing developments for a documentary about the Bay Area's housing crisis. I'm a freelance filmmaker, specializing in urban development stories, and I'd been documenting abandoned and failed real estate projects across Northern California for the past year. Someone on a real estate forum had mentioned a completed subdivision in South San Jose that had never sold a single house, sitting empty for 3 years despite being finished and ready for occupancy. The basic facts were straightforward and documented. Meadowbrook Estates had been developed by a company called Westbridge Development Group, which had purchased 40 acres of former agricultural land in South San Jose in 2018. They'd broken ground in 2019, and by October 2021 the entire development was complete: 47 houses, all utilities connected, streets paved, landscaping installed, ready for residents. But Westbridge had filed for bankruptcy in November 2021, the day after the final inspection was completed. The property had been tied up in bankruptcy proceedings ever since, with various creditors fighting over who owned what, and the neighborhood had sat empty for 3 years while lawyers argued in court. On paper, it was just another story of developer overreach and financial mismanagement. But when I started researching the details, I found aspects that didn't quite add up. Westbridge had no history of real estate development before this project. The company had been formed specifically to build Meadowbrook Estates, had somehow secured financing for a 47-house development despite having no track record, and had completed the project on time and on budget before immediately going bankrupt. The timeline was too neat, too convenient, and the company's sudden appearance and disappearance felt orchestrated rather than organic. I drove out to Meadowbrook Estates on a gray afternoon in late November, approaching it from the main road that connected to South San Jose's sprawl of suburban development. The entrance was marked by a stone gateway, with Meadowbrook Estates carved into it, flanked by professionally landscaped gardens that had been maintained recently despite the neighborhood's abandonment. The streets beyond the gateway looked normal, clean pavement, sidewalks, street signs marking intersections with names like Willow Court and Maple Drive. I parked just inside the entrance and started walking, camera in hand, planning to document the empty houses and get some interviews with neighbors from the surrounding area about having an abandoned development next to their homes. The first few houses looked exactly as I'd expected: modern suburban construction, beige and gray exteriors, 2-car garages, small front yards with maintained landscaping. They appeared vacant, no cars in driveways, no signs of occupation. But as I got closer to the first house, I noticed furniture visible through the windows. Not just 1 or 2 pieces left behind, but fully furnished rooms, couches, tables, lamps, decorations on walls. I walked up to the window and looked in more carefully. The living room was completely furnished in what looked like brand new furniture, arranged as if someone lived there. But something about the arrangement felt wrong. The couch faced a wall instead of the television. The coffee table was positioned at an angle that made no sense for the room's layout. Chairs were placed in corners facing away from any focal point. I walked around to the back of the house and looked through more windows. The kitchen was fully equipped, dishes in cabinets, visible through glass doors, appliances that looked new and functional. But the kitchen table was pushed against a wall in a way that blocked access to the cabinets, and the chairs were all facing outward in different directions rather than toward the table. I tried the front door. It was unlocked. I called out, announcing my presence, but got no response. I stepped inside, my camera recording everything. The interior was climate-controlled, the air was temperate, suggesting the utilities were active. The house was completely furnished, every room containing furniture and decorations, but nothing was arranged the way a human would live in the space. In the master bedroom, the bed was positioned in the hallway leading to the bathroom, blocking normal passage. The dresser faced into a closet. The bedside tables were pushed into corners away from the bed. In another bedroom, what appeared to be a child's room, toys were arranged in precise geometric patterns on the floor, and the bed was turned on its side against a wall. I documented everything, moving through the house room by room, becoming increasingly unsettled by the wrongness of it all. This wasn't random abandonment or vandalism. The furniture was deliberately placed, carefully positioned, but according to some logic that didn't match human habitation. It was like someone had understood that houses contained furniture, but didn't understand how furniture related to human use. I left that first house and walked to the next one. Also unlocked, also furnished, also arranged wrong. The pattern repeated through the first 5 houses I checked, all fully furnished, all arranged in ways that violated basic ergonomics and spatial logic. Beds in hallways, seating facing walls, tables positioned to block movement rather than facilitate it. As I walked deeper into the neighborhood, I started noticing problems with the street layout. The initial grid pattern had seemed normal, but the deeper streets didn't line up correctly. I'd walk down what should be a straight road, and it would curve in a way that the sightlines suggested it shouldn't. Houses that appeared to face each other were actually oriented at odd angles when I got close to them. The lot boundaries didn't match the house positions. Houses were placed on their lots in ways that left unusable gaps or created awkward overlaps with neighboring properties. I pulled out my phone and tried to use GPS to map my position, but the location kept jumping around, showing me in different parts of the neighborhood from moment to moment, as if the streets themselves weren't consistent in their relationship to geographic coordinates. I reached what the street signs indicated was the center of the development, a small park area with playground equipment and benches. The playground was installed and looked new, but the equipment was positioned strangely. Swings faced away from the park rather than into it. A slide was installed at an angle that made it unusable. The benches were all turned to face outward, creating no social space, just isolated seats looking in different directions. I sat on one of the benches and reviewed the footage I'd captured, trying to make sense of what I was documenting. The houses were built to code. I could see that from the construction quality. They'd passed inspections, but they were furnished and oriented according to some principle that had nothing to do with human living patterns. I decided to walk the perimeter of the development to get a sense of its full size and relationship to the surrounding area. I started following what I thought was the outer ring of streets, but after 20 minutes of walking, I hadn't reached the edge of the neighborhood. I should have completed a circuit of 47 houses in that time, but I was still seeing houses, still walking through streets that curved and connected in ways that didn't match the mental map I'd formed. I tried to navigate back to my car, heading in what I thought was the direction of the entrance. But the streets didn't lead where I expected. I'd turn onto what looked like the street I'd come in on, only to find myself in a section of the neighborhood I didn't recognize. The houses started looking too similar, identical models in the same colors, making it hard to use them as landmarks. I pulled out my phone to call for directions but had no signal. Not unusual in some suburban developments where cell coverage is spotty, but unsettling given my disorientation. I kept walking, trying different streets, looking for the entrance gateway. I walked for over an hour, the afternoon light fading, before I finally saw my car in the distance, parked near the entrance where I'd left it. I got in the car and drove out immediately, feeling a relief that was disproportionate to the actual danger I'd been in. I'd just gotten lost in a subdivision, disorienting but not life-threatening. But something about the experience had triggered a deeper anxiety, a sense that the neighborhood didn't want to be left, that it was designed to confuse and retain rather than accommodate and release. I went back twice more over the following month, each time trying to document the neighborhood more systematically, to understand its layout and explain the wrongness I'd observed. On my second visit, I brought surveying equipment and tried to map the street grid accurately, but the measurements didn't make sense. Distances between houses varied in ways that violated the consistent lot sizes shown on the development plans. Streets that should have been parallel diverged at angles that created impossible geometry. On my third visit, I focused on the interiors, photographing the furniture arrangements in detail, trying to find any pattern or logic to how things were placed. I documented 20 houses that day, and every one showed the same characteristics, fully furnished with new furniture, everything positioned in ways that didn't correspond to human use patterns. And I started noticing that some furniture had moved since my first visit. Not dramatically, but chairs that had been in corners were now in different corners. Tables that had been against one wall were against another. Something was rearranging the furniture, adjusting the interiors, maintaining the houses in their strange configured state. On my fourth visit, I brought a colleague, another filmmaker named Sarah, who specialized in architectural documentation. I wanted a second perspective, someone to confirm that what I was seeing was really as strange as I thought it was. We spent 6 hours in the neighborhood that day, documenting houses, mapping streets, trying to find patterns. Sarah was as disturbed as I was by what we found. This place feels like it was designed by something that studied human neighborhoods, but didn't understand them, she said. Like an AI trained on suburban development photos, but without any concept of why humans build this way. We were in one of the houses on the western edge of the development when we both heard movement upstairs. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, walking from room to room above us. We called out, identifying ourselves, asking if anyone was there. The footsteps stopped. We climbed the stairs carefully, cameras ready, expecting to find squatters or security personnel. The upstairs was empty, but in the master bedroom, a dresser that had been against the north wall when we checked the room 30 minutes earlier was now against the east wall. And the bed, which had been positioned blocking the hallway, was now in a corner facing a closet. The furniture had been rearranged while we were downstairs, moved by whoever or whatever we'd heard walking above us. We left immediately, Sarah refused to go back. She said the neighborhood felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate, that being there triggered some deep survival instinct that warned her to leave and not return. She wouldn't use any of the footage we'd captured together, didn't want to be associated with the project. I went back one more time, alone, 2 weeks ago. I went during daylight, determined to document the neighborhood completely, to get enough footage for the documentary, even if I didn't fully understand what I was documenting. I worked quickly, moving through houses, filming the strange furniture arrangements, the impossible street geometries, the park equipment positioned for no purpose. In one house near the development center, I found something that made everything worse. In what should have been a dining room, positioned in the middle of the floor where a table should be, there was a scale model of Meadowbrook Estates, detailed, professionally built, showing all 47 houses and the street layout. But the model showed the neighborhood as it should have been built, streets in a normal grid. Houses oriented correctly on their lots, a rational suburban development. Next to the model was a set of architectural plans, dated from 2019, showing the same normal layout. And next to those plans was a second set of drawings, dated 2021, showing the neighborhood as it actually existed, streets at wrong angles, houses oriented strangely, the geometry distorted and impossible. Between 2019 and 2021, something had changed. The plans had been altered, the construction had followed a different logic, and Meadowbrook Estates had been built according to specifications that didn't match human needs or standard architectural practice. I was photographing the plans when I heard movement throughout the house, not just one set of footsteps, but many, moving through multiple rooms simultaneously, approaching from different directions. I grabbed my camera and ran for the front door, bursting out into fading afternoon light. Behind me, through the windows of the house, I could see furniture moving, being rearranged, repositioned according to that alien logic that governed this place. I ran back to my car, started it, and drove toward the entrance. But the streets had changed again. The path I'd taken in no longer leading out. I drove for 20 minutes through streets that curved and looped, and never reached the gateway I'd entered through. Finally, in desperation, I turned onto a street at random and floored the accelerator, and somehow I found myself on the access road outside the development, the Meadowbrook Estates gateway receding behind me. I haven't been back. I've tried to research who actually financed the development, who made the decisions that resulted in this impossible neighborhood, but Westbridge Development Group's records are sealed in bankruptcy proceedings. I've tried to warn other urban explorers about the place, but my descriptions sound crazy. A neighborhood that's bigger on the inside than the outside, furniture that moves by itself, streets that change their configuration. The neighborhood is still there, empty and waiting. The landscaping is still maintained by someone or something. The utilities are still active. And inside those 47 houses, furniture continues to be arranged and rearranged according to principles that have nothing to do with human habitation. I think Meadowbrook Estates was never meant for people. I think it was built for something else, something that needed the structure and appearance of a human neighborhood, but that experiences space and geometry differently than we do. And I think that something is living there now, moving through those houses, rearranging furniture, maintaining the development for purposes I can't understand. The documentary project is abandoned. I can't explain what I found in a way that would make sense to an audience. But I drive past the entrance sometimes, seeing that gateway with its maintained landscaping, knowing that beyond it, 47 houses sit, furnished and waiting, their interiors arranged for residents that aren't human, their streets configured according to geometry that doesn't match our world. And I wonder what would happen if someone actually tried to move in, if a family bought one of those houses and tried to live there. I think the neighborhood would adjust around them, rearrange them, reposition them the way it repositions the furniture, until they fit the strange logic of that place. And I don't think they'd ever find their way out. While driving through the Mojave Desert near Barstow, I found a radio station that broadcasts news from 24 hours in the future, and I've been listening to it for 3 weeks, and I'm terrified of what I heard yesterday about what's supposed to happen today. I'm a long-haul truck driver, running routes between Los Angeles and Las Vegas 3 or 4 times a week, and I spend a lot of time on Interstate 15 cutting through the Mojave. It's lonely work, hours of driving through empty desert with nothing but the road and whatever's on the radio to keep you company. I found the station by accident on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. I'd been scanning through channels trying to find something better than static or the same classic rock stations that reach into the desert from both cities. Around mile marker 187, just past Barstow, I hit 87.9 FM and got a clear signal, a news broadcast, professional sounding, the kind of local news programming you'd hear on any small market station. The announcer was reporting traffic conditions on the 15, warning about an accident near Victorville that was causing delays. I'd just driven through Victorville an hour ago, and traffic had been clear, so I figured the accident must have happened after I passed through. But then the announcer said the accident had occurred this morning around 9 a.m., and I checked my watch, it was 2:30 p.m. I'd driven through Victorville at 1:15 p.m., and there had been no accident, no traffic delay, nothing that suggested a major incident had occurred that morning. I kept listening. The weather report followed, and the announcer described conditions for today: clear skies, high temperature of 68 degrees, light winds from the northwest, but it was currently 73 degrees, partly cloudy, and the wind was coming from the southwest. The forecast didn't match the actual weather I was experiencing. I figured it was a recording, some kind of pre-recorded programming running on a delay, maybe from the previous day or even earlier in the week. But something about the broadcast felt current, the announcer's tone, the way stories were presented, the specific details that suggested real-time reporting rather than canned content. The next news item caught my full attention. The announcer reported on a developing story about a warehouse fire in Barstow. He gave details: location on Industrial Parkway, fire department response. No injuries reported, but significant property damage. I knew Barstow well enough to know Industrial Parkway, and I hadn't seen or heard anything about a fire. No smoke visible from the highway, no emergency vehicles heading in that direction. I made a note of the story and continued driving. When I got to Las Vegas that evening, I looked up news about Barstow. Nothing about a warehouse fire. I checked local news websites, police scanner feeds, social media, no reports of any fire on Industrial Parkway. The next day, driving the return route from Vegas to LA, I checked the news again during my break in Barstow. There it was, a warehouse fire on Industrial Parkway, reported that morning around 9 a.m., exactly as the radio station had described it. Fire department had responded, no injuries, significant property damage. Every detail matched what I'd heard on 87.9 FM 24 hours earlier. I tried to find 87.9 FM again on my drive back, and around the same location near mile marker 187, the signal came in clear. Another news broadcast, professional and current sounding. This time I paid very close attention to every story, writing down details as I drove. A car theft in Victorville, a high school sports score, weather forecast, local business opening. I documented everything I heard. The following day, I checked each story. The car theft happened exactly as reported. The sports game ended with the exact score I'd written down. The weather matched the forecast I'd heard. The business opened as announced. Every single detail from the broadcast came true, exactly 24 hours after I'd heard it reported, as if it had already happened. I started making weekly trips to that section of highway, specifically to pick up 87.9 FM, recording the broadcasts, documenting every story, verifying them against actual news the following day. Over 3 weeks, I recorded over 30 hours of broadcasts and checked hundreds of individual news items. The accuracy rate was 100%. Everything the station reported happened exactly as described, exactly 24 hours after the broadcast. The station only came in clearly in a specific section of the 15, roughly between mile markers 185 and 190, a 5-mile stretch of highway in the emptiest part of the Mojave between Barstow and Baker. Outside that range, the signal degraded into static. I tried to find information about what broadcaster operated on 87.9 FM in that area, but FCC records showed no licensed station at that frequency anywhere in the region. I became obsessed with understanding what I'd found. I researched temporal anomalies, looked for other reports of radio stations broadcasting from the future, found scattered accounts online of people claiming to receive broadcasts from other times, but nothing credible or verified. I recorded every broadcast I could pick up, filling my phone's memory with audio files, creating detailed logs of predictions and their subsequent confirmations. The broadcast followed a pattern. They always presented news as if it were current, using present tense, describing events as happening today or this morning or earlier this afternoon. But every event they described would actually occur 24 hours later. The station was broadcasting from tomorrow, or it was broadcasting today's news tomorrow, or it existed in some temporal displacement where its now was 24 hours ahead of actual now. I never heard any station identification, no call letters, no announcer names, just professional news reporting, traffic updates, weather forecasts, local stories from the Barstow and Victorville area. The voices sounded human, not artificial or synthesized. The content was specific and detailed, full of the kind of information that would be hard to fake or predict accurately. 3 days ago, I was making my regular drive through that section of highway, recorder ready, waiting for 87.9 FM to come in. The signal appeared right on schedule at mile marker 187, and I started recording. The broadcast began with traffic conditions, then weather, then moved into local news stories. About 15 minutes into the broadcast, the announcer reported on a missing person case. A truck driver, the announcer said, had disappeared in the Mojave Desert. Last seen driving toward Barstow on Interstate 15, the driver's truck had been found abandoned near mile marker 189. No sign of the driver, no indication of what had happened. Search efforts were ongoing, but the driver remained missing. The description of the truck matched mine exactly: make, model, color, even the company logo on the side. The description of the missing driver matched me: age, general appearance, physical build. And then the announcer said the name, slightly garbled by static but unmistakable. My name, pronounced just distorted enough that it could have been a misheard different name, but that I knew was meant to be mine. According to the broadcast, I had disappeared yesterday, which meant by the station's 24-hour advanced timeline, I was supposed to disappear today. The truck found abandoned at mile marker 189, which was right in the middle of where I always picked up the station's signal. The search ongoing, the driver never found. I pulled over immediately, hands shaking, and listened to the rest of the broadcast. They returned to the story twice more during the hour I could pick up the signal, adding details each time. The truck had been found with the engine still running, driver's door open, personal belongings inside, including my phone and wallet. No signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the vehicle, no indication of where I had gone. Search teams with dogs had found nothing. I had simply vanished. I drove straight home to Los Angeles, staying on the highway, not stopping, not deviating from the route. I called my dispatcher and told him I was sick, taking a few days off. I've been in my apartment ever since, 3 days now, refusing to drive anywhere, especially not toward Barstow, definitely not on Interstate 15. But the static has started. It began yesterday morning, a faint crackling that sounds like radio interference, coming from no identifiable source. It's not my radio. I've checked, unplugged everything. It's not my phone or computer. It's just there, present in my apartment, a background noise that sounds exactly like the static between radio stations. And sometimes, very faintly, I can hear voices in the static. The same professional announcer voice from 87.9 FM, too distorted to make out words, but unmistakably, the same cadence and tone. It's loudest near my windows, especially the one that faces southeast, toward the desert. I've tried to research what happens to the people in the news stories I heard on the station. The car theft victim, the business owner, the people involved in the traffic accident, they all exist. All confirm that the events happened exactly as reported. None of them heard the broadcast beforehand. To them, these were just normal events, things that happened and were then reported on the news. They weren't aware of being predicted, weren't conscious of fulfilling some predetermined narrative. But I heard my own disappearance reported before it happened. I know what I'm supposed to do today: drive toward Barstow, reach mile marker 189, abandon my truck with the engine running and the door open, and vanish into the desert without a trace. The broadcast has already reported it. The news has already been delivered to anyone listening to 87.9 FM yesterday. I've considered the possibilities. Maybe the station doesn't predict the future, maybe it creates it, establishes a timeline that then becomes mandatory, traps people into fulfilling the events it reports. Maybe hearing your own future reported locks you into that timeline, makes it inevitable. Or maybe the future is fixed, predetermined, and the station is just giving me advance warning of what's going to happen regardless of what I do. I've tried to tell people, called a friend, tried to explain about the station and the predictions and hearing about my own disappearance. He thought I was having some kind of breakdown, suggested I see a doctor, talk to someone about the stress of long-haul driving. I called my brother, and he was more sympathetic, but equally skeptical. "Don't go to Barstow then," he said, as if it were that simple, as if staying away from the desert would be enough to break whatever pattern the broadcast had established. But the static keeps getting louder. It's constant now, filling my apartment with that crackling interference sound, and the compulsion to drive is growing stronger. I keep thinking about my truck, about the route to Vegas, about mile marker 189. I keep feeling the need to get in the vehicle and drive, to complete the route I've driven hundreds of times, to be where I'm supposed to be. This morning I found myself dressed and holding my keys, standing at my apartment door, ready to leave. I have no memory of deciding to go anywhere, but some part of me was preparing to drive to Barstow to fulfill what the broadcast had reported. I forced myself to put the keys down, to sit back down, to stay in the apartment, but I don't know how long I can resist. The static is so loud now that I can barely think. The voices in the interference are getting clearer, and I can almost make out what they're saying. Traffic conditions on the 15. Weather in the Mojave. A missing truck driver, last seen near Barstow, search efforts ongoing. I'm writing this as a record, as evidence of what I found and what I heard. If I disappear, if they find my truck abandoned at mile marker 189 with the engine running and the door open, if search teams look for me and find nothing, at least this document will exist. Maybe it will help explain what happened, or maybe it will just be dismissed as the paranoid delusions of someone who cracked under the isolation of long-haul driving. The station is broadcasting right now. I can hear it clearly through the static in my apartment, even though I'm nowhere near the desert, even though there's no radio tuned to 87.9 FM. The announcer is reporting on today's news, which is actually tomorrow's news, which includes the ongoing search for a missing truck driver who disappeared yesterday, which means today, which means now. I can feel the pull to leave, to get in my truck and drive. Every instinct I have is telling me to go to the desert, to reach mile marker 189, to step out of my vehicle with the engine still running and walk into the empty spaces between the Joshua trees and the creosote bushes. The broadcast has reported it, so it must happen. The future has already been narrated, and I'm supposed to fulfill it. I don't want to go. I want to stay here, in my apartment, far from the Mojave and Interstate 15 and that 5-mile stretch of highway where tomorrow becomes today and the future is already news. But the static keeps getting louder, and the pull keeps getting stronger, and I can feel myself preparing to leave, gathering my things, reaching for my keys. If you're driving through the Mojave near Barstow, between mile markers 185 and 190, and you scan to 87.9 FM and pick up a news broadcast, don't listen too carefully. Don't pay attention to the specific details. Don't compare what you hear to what's currently happening. Because if you hear about yourself, if the broadcast reports on your future, you might become trapped in it, pulled toward fulfilling what's already been narrated, unable to avoid a fate that's been reported as past tense before it's even begun. The static is deafening now. The voices are clear. They're reporting on the missing driver, me describing the ongoing search, the abandoned truck, the mystery of the disappearance. Present tense for them, which means it's happening now, which means I'm already gone, already walking into the desert, already fulfilling what was predicted 24 hours ago. I'm putting down my pen and picking up my keys. The pull is irresistible now. I know I shouldn't go, know that driving to mile marker 189 is exactly what I'm supposed to avoid, but I can't stop myself. The broadcast has reported it, and what's been reported must happen. If you find this, if you find my truck with the engine running and the door open, and this document on the passenger seat, know that I tried to stay away. Know that I understood what was happening and tried to resist. But the future that 87.9 FM broadcasts isn't just prediction, it's prescription. And once you've heard yourself in the news from tomorrow, you can't avoid becoming the story that's already been told. The static is perfect clarity now. It's not interference, it's the signal, and I've been tuned to it all along. The station isn't broadcasting from somewhere else. It's broadcasting from the desert, from mile marker 189, from the place where I'm about to disappear. I'm leaving now. I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it. The future is calling, and it's already happened. And I have to fulfill it because it's already been reported, and the news is never wrong. Not on 87.9 FM. Not when it's broadcasting from tomorrow. The Getty Center in Los Angeles closes at 5:30 p.m., but there's a version of the museum that exists after hours, accessible only through specific doors at specific times, and I've been inside it 3 times, and I don't think the art in the after-hours Getty is from our world. I work as a security guard at the Getty, doing the overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week. It's a job I've had for almost 2 years now, walking the same galleries, checking the same doors, making the same rounds through one of the world's most prestigious art museums when it's empty and silent. The Getty Center is enormous, a complex of buildings perched on a hilltop in the Santa Monica Mountains, housing collections worth billions of dollars. During the day, it's crowded with visitors, tourists photographing the architecture and the views, art students sketching in the galleries, scholars doing research. At night, it belongs to the security staff, a small crew of us who monitor the cameras, walk the floors, make sure nothing and no one disturbs the art or the buildings. I know the Getty's layout better than I know my own apartment. I've walked every gallery hundreds of times, memorized the placement of every major piece, learned the quirks of every door and hallway. The museum is consistent, predictable, the art unchanging from night to night. You could navigate it blindfolded after enough shifts, following the same route through the same rooms, past the same paintings and sculptures. That's why I knew immediately that something was wrong when I opened the East Pavilion second-floor gallery door around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in April and found a completely different room. I'd opened that door thousands of times. It led to a gallery of European paintings from the 1600s, a collection I could describe from memory portraits, religious scenes, landscapes arranged in a specific order that never changed. But when I opened it that night, I found myself looking into a gallery I'd never seen before. The architecture was the same, the Getty's distinctive design, travertine stone walls, natural light systems that of course weren't operating at 2 a.m. But the art was different. Instead of 17th century European paintings, the walls displayed works I didn't recognize. Abstract pieces that hurt to look at directly, their geometries wrong in ways that made my eyes water. Portraits of people in clothing styles I'd never seen, their faces too symmetrical, their expressions too neutral. Landscapes depicting places that looked almost familiar, mountains that might have been the Rockies, but with wrong peaks. Cities that resembled Los Angeles, but with buildings in incorrect positions. Coastlines that could have been California, but with geography that didn't match anywhere real. I stood in the doorway for maybe 30 seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. My first thought was that the Getty had installed a new exhibit, that someone had reorganized the gallery, and I hadn't been notified. But that made no sense. Rotating art in a museum this size requires months of planning, comprehensive staff briefings, documentation. You don't just swap out a gallery overnight without the security team knowing about it. I stepped into the gallery, my flashlight beam cutting across unfamiliar paintings. The room felt the same as every other Getty gallery, same dimensions, same lighting fixtures, same environmental controls. But every piece of art was wrong, unknown, unsettling in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I walked through the gallery slowly, examining the paintings more closely. The abstract pieces seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, their patterns rearranging subtly, as if they were alive or still being painted. The portraits all featured subjects with that same too-perfect symmetry, faces that were human but somehow wrong, eyes that seemed to track my movement with uncomfortable awareness. The landscapes were the most disturbing. They depicted recognizable types of terrain, mountains, forests, cities, coastlines, but none of them matched real geography. I saw what appeared to be the Hollywood sign, but the letters were different and the hills behind it had the wrong shape. I saw the Golden Gate Bridge, spanning a bay that wasn't San Francisco Bay, connecting to land that didn't match the actual topology of that area. Every landscape showed a version of somewhere that almost existed but didn't quite match reality. I spent maybe 20 minutes in that gallery, photographing paintings with my phone, documenting what I was seeing, trying to find any information plaques or labels that might explain the exhibit. There were no labels, no documentation, no indication of artists or dates or provenance, just the art itself, displayed on walls in a museum where it shouldn't exist. When I finally left the gallery and closed the door behind me, I immediately reopened it to verify what I'd seen. The door led to the normal gallery, the familiar 17th century European paintings in their usual positions, everything exactly as it should be. The strange gallery was gone, replaced instantly with the permanent collection I knew. I reported what I'd experienced to my supervisor when my shift ended. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. No one had changed any galleries. No special exhibits were being installed. The museum was exactly as it had been, exactly as it always was. He suggested I might be tired, working too many overnight shifts, maybe seeing things in the low light and empty spaces that weren't really there. But I knew what I'd seen. I had photographs on my phone, except when I checked them later, they showed the normal gallery, the familiar paintings, nothing unusual or wrong. Whatever I'd photographed had either not captured what I'd seen or had changed back along with the physical space. It happened again the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week later. Different door this time, the West Pavilion ground floor entrance to the sculpture gallery. I opened it during my 2 a.m. rounds and found a completely different space. Same Getty architecture, but filled with sculptures I'd never seen. Abstract pieces in materials I couldn't identify. Figurative works depicting subjects that looked almost human but with proportions that were subtly wrong. Installations that seemed to create impossible spatial relationships. I explored for about 15 minutes that time, more cautious than my first visit, more aware that I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. The sculptures had the same quality as the paintings from the previous week, that sense of being almost familiar, almost right, but fundamentally wrong in ways that suggested they came from somewhere that wasn't quite our world. When I left and reopened the door, it led to the normal sculpture gallery, the permanent collection in its expected positions. I checked my photos again. They showed the normal gallery, nothing unusual. The third time it happened was different. It was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday 3 weeks later, and I'd started to notice the pattern. Tuesdays, early morning hours, doors I'd opened countless times before. I was in the photography gallery when I found it, opening a door to a storage area I'd accessed regularly for almost 2 years. Instead of the storage area, I found a photography exhibition I'd never seen. The photographs were all of the Getty Center itself, exterior shots of the buildings, interior shots of the galleries, images of the grounds and gardens, but they were populated with visitors who weren't quite human. The figures in the photographs had the right general shape, bipedal, clothed, moving through the museum as visitors would, but their proportions were wrong. Their limbs slightly too long or too short, their heads not quite the right size for their bodies. And the way they moved, captured in those frozen photographic moments, suggested motion that didn't follow normal human biomechanics. They weren't walking so much as flowing, weren't standing so much as hovering slightly above the ground. I studied those photographs for over half an hour, trying to understand what I was seeing. The Getty Center in the images was identical to the real Getty. Same buildings, same layout, same architectural details. But it was populated by these wrong visitors. Hundreds of them in some shots, all moving through galleries that might have been the ones I walked every night, but might have been something else. Some version of the Getty that existed parallel to the real one. One photograph in particular disturbed me deeply. It showed a security guard in Getty uniform standing in a gallery, flashlight in hand, looking at art. The composition, the angle, the lighting, they all suggested the photograph had been taken from behind someone viewing the guard, as if another visitor had photographed the guard during his rounds. But the guard's posture was wrong, his stance too still, his proportions subtly off like all the other figures in the photographs. And I realized with growing horror that the gallery in the background was one of the after-hours galleries, showing the strange art that didn't exist in the normal Getty. I backed away from that photograph and left the exhibition quickly, closing the door behind me. When I reopened it, the storage area was back, exactly as it should be, filled with the museum's ordinary equipment and supplies. I've tried to understand what I'm experiencing. I've researched the Getty's history, looking for any unusual events or circumstances that might explain galleries that appear and disappear, art that doesn't match any known collections. I found nothing unusual. The Getty Center opened in 1997, built to museum standards, housing a carefully curated collection of European paintings, sculptures, and photographs. No reports of architectural anomalies, no mysterious exhibitions, no art from unknown sources. I've talked to other security guards, carefully bringing up the subject without sounding crazy, asking if anyone has ever encountered galleries they didn't recognize or art they'd never seen before. Most of them just shook their heads, looked at me strangely, suggested I might need more sleep. But one guard, an older man named Frank, who'd worked at the Getty since it opened, pulled me aside after my questioning. "You're seeing the other Getty?" he said quietly. "The one that exists alongside this one, the version that's almost the same but not quite. It appears sometimes, usually at night, usually on Tuesdays for some reason. I've seen it maybe a dozen times over the years. Different galleries, different art, always with that feeling of wrongness, like you're looking at a museum from somewhere else." He told me he'd stopped exploring when it appeared, stopped trying to document or understand it. "It's not our world," he said. "The art isn't from here. The visitors in those photographs aren't human, not really. And the more you engage with it, the more you see it. I used to encounter it once a year maybe, then once a month, then weekly. I stopped exploring, stopped investigating, and it started appearing less frequently. Now I barely see it at all." I asked him what he thought it was, where the other Getty came from. He shrugged. "Maybe there are multiple versions of reality, and sometimes they overlap. Maybe the Getty Center exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and usually we only perceive our version, but sometimes the boundaries blur and we see the others. Or maybe I'm just as crazy as you probably think you are, and we're both hallucinating the same thing." Since that conversation with Frank, I've tried to follow his advice. When I encounter the after hours, Getty now, and it still happens, about once a week, always on Tuesday nights, in the early morning hours, I don't explore. I open the door, see the different gallery, and immediately close it and move on with my rounds. I don't photograph the art, don't examine the pieces closely, don't try to understand or document what I'm seeing. But it's getting harder to avoid. The transitions are lasting longer. The first time, the gallery reverted to normal as soon as I closed and reopened the door. Now sometimes I have to close and reopen a door 3 or 4 times before the normal gallery reappears. And the after-hours version is appearing through more doors. It used to be just 1 or 2 specific entrances, but now almost any door in the museum might lead to the wrong version, the other Getty, where the art comes from somewhere else. Last Tuesday, I encountered something new that terrified me more than anything I'd seen before. I opened a gallery door and found the after-hours version, as expected. But this time, there were visitors in the gallery, not the wrong visitors from the photographs, but actual people, wandering through the space, looking at the disturbing art. I approached them carefully, ready to explain that the museum was closed, that they shouldn't be here. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't quite right. Their movements were too smooth, too fluid. Their proportions were subtly wrong, just like the figures in the photographs. And when they turned to look at me, their faces had that same too perfect symmetry, those same unnaturally aware eyes that tracked my movement with uncomfortable precision. One of them spoke to me, and the voice was wrong, too melodious. The words formed correctly, but with rhythms that didn't match human speech patterns. "We appreciate your museum," it said. "Your collection is fascinating, so different from ours." I backed away without responding and left the gallery immediately, closing the door and opening it repeatedly until the normal gallery returned. But the encounter has left me deeply unsettled. The after hours Getty isn't just a parallel space with strange art, it's inhabited, visited by things that aren't human but that can speak and interact and perceive us the same way we're starting to perceive them. I'm writing this as a record of what I've experienced, what I continue to experience every Tuesday night when I work my shift at the Getty Center. I don't know if the boundaries between our version and the other version are breaking down, if the overlap is becoming more frequent and more persistent. I don't know if other museums experience the same thing, if there are parallel versions of the Met or the Louvre or the Uffizi, where the art comes from elsewhere and the visitors aren't quite human. I know that I still work at the Getty, still walk those galleries every night, still open doors that might lead to the normal museum or might lead to the other version. And I know that Frank was right. The more I engage with it, the more frequently I see it. It's appearing almost every shift now, multiple times per night. The after-hours Getty bleeding through into my normal rounds with increasing persistence. Tonight is Tuesday. I'm writing this before my shift starts, documenting what I know while I still remember clearly, while I can still distinguish between the normal Getty and the other version. But I'm afraid that distinction is fading, that soon I won't be sure which version I'm walking through, which galleries are showing real art from our world, and which are displaying pieces from somewhere else. And I'm afraid that one night I'll walk through a door and find myself in the after hours, Getty permanently, unable to find my way back to the normal museum, trapped in galleries full of art that hurts to look at and visited by things that look almost human, but aren't. Things that appreciate our museum, our collection, our world that's so different from theirs. The Getty Center closes at 5:30 p.m., but another version opens after dark, accessible through doors that lead to galleries that shouldn't exist, displaying art from somewhere that isn't quite here. And every Tuesday night, I walk those galleries, never knowing if the door I open will lead to the museum I know or the museum that exists alongside it, populated by visitors who aren't quite human and filled with art from a world that's almost like ours, but fundamentally, terribly wrong. The leftmost lane of the 405 freeway northbound between the 10 and Sunset Boulevard is always closed during overnight hours, and I've driven in that closed lane and it doesn't go where the rest of the freeway goes. I'm a long-haul trucker, running routes between San Diego and the Bay Area 3 or 4 times a week, which means I drive through Los Angeles frequently, usually timing my trips to hit the city in the early morning hours when traffic is lightest. The 405 through West LA is always a nightmare during the day, but between midnight and 5 a.m., it's usually clear enough to maintain good speed. I've been driving this route for 6 years, and I know every mile of the 405 intimately. I know which lanes have the worst potholes, which exits back up even in the middle of the night, which overpasses have the tightest clearances for my rig. And I know that the leftmost lane northbound between the 10 interchange and Sunset Boulevard is always closed during overnight hours, coned off with those orange barrels and signs indicating ongoing maintenance. I've never seen any actual work being done in that lane. No construction crews, no equipment, no evidence of repair or improvement. Just the cones and barrels, moved into place sometime after dark and removed before morning rush hour, closing off a lane that appears to be in perfect condition. I've always assumed it was some kind of Caltrans project, maybe underground work or structural inspection that didn't require visible crews, the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure maintenance that happens invisibly in a city this size. The first time I drove in the closed lane was about 4 months ago, on a Tuesday night in late July. I was northbound on the 405 around 3 a.m., traffic completely clear, making good time through West LA. Just past the 10 interchange, I came up behind a car doing maybe 40 miles per hour in the middle lane, hazards on, clearly having some kind of mechanical problem. The right lane had a few other vehicles, and rather than slow down or weave through traffic, I moved left into the closed lane to pass. The lane was in perfect condition. Smooth pavement, clear markings, no construction, no debris, no obvious reason for the closure. I accelerated past the slow vehicle and stayed in the closed lane for a few seconds longer than necessary, irritated by the waste of a perfectly good lane, before starting to merge back to the right. But as I checked my mirrors to merge, I noticed something wrong with the view. The other lanes were still there, still visible, the highway structure unchanged, but the buildings and landmarks beyond the freeway didn't match what I expected to see. I was in West LA. I should have been seeing the familiar sprawl of apartment buildings and office complexes, the distinctive skyline of Century City to the east. Instead, I was seeing buildings I didn't recognize similar in style, the same general type of commercial and residential architecture, but arranged differently, taller or shorter than they should be, positioned in ways that didn't match the actual geography. I slowed down, looking more carefully at my surroundings. The freeway itself seemed normal, same number of lanes, same general direction, still clearly a major highway. But the exit signs were wrong. Instead of familiar streets like Wilshire or Santa Monica Boulevard, I saw signs for exits I'd never heard of: Ashland Avenue, Carson Boulevard, streets that didn't exist in the LA I knew. The other vehicles on the freeway looked almost right but subtly wrong. I saw cars that resembled familiar makes and models, something like a Honda Civic, something like a Ford F-150, but the details were off. Badge placement wasn't quite right, body proportions slightly different, design elements that didn't match any actual vehicle I could identify. And the license plates were from states I didn't recognize, abbreviations that didn't match any US state, registration formats that looked official but wrong. I kept driving, now fully committed to understanding what I was seeing. My GPS showed me on the 405 northbound, the blue line tracking my position normally, But when I looked at the map details, the street names around the freeway didn't match what I was seeing on the exit signs. The GPS insisted I was passing Wilshire, but the exit sign overhead said Ashland Avenue. I stayed in the closed lane for what felt like 10 miles, maybe 15 minutes of driving, watching this wrong version of Los Angeles scroll past. The basic geography was similar enough: mountains to the north, ocean to the west, the general layout of a coastal basin, but all the specific details were off, like I was driving through a Los Angeles that had developed differently, where different streets had been built, different buildings constructed, different decisions made about urban planning. Finally, approaching what should have been the Sunset Boulevard exit, I merged back into the normal lanes. The transition was immediate and jarring. One moment I was in the wrong Los Angeles with its unfamiliar streets and strange vehicles. The next I was back in the familiar version, Century City visible in the distance exactly as it should be. Exit signs showing streets I recognized. I checked my GPS log when I stopped for a break in Santa Clarita. According to the tracking, I'd maintained steady progress up the 405, no deviation from the normal route. But my trip time showed I'd lost 15 minutes, somewhere between the 10 and Sunset. The GPS showed me covering that distance in the expected amount of time, but my actual elapsed time was 15 minutes longer than it should have been, as if I'd driven at normal speed but through a longer version of the same route. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe I'd been more tired than I thought, had zoned out for a few minutes, imagined the wrong details in the low light and sparse traffic. Maybe the exit signs had been temporary diversions I'd misread. The vehicles just unfamiliar models I hadn't encountered before, but I couldn't explain the GPS discrepancy. Couldn't account for the missing 15 minutes. I went back to that section of the 405 the following week, same time of night, planning to see if I could replicate what had happened. The leftmost lane was closed as usual, coned off between the 10 and Sunset. I merged into it around 3 a.m., driving in perfectly good pavement with no explanation for the closure. This time I paid very careful attention to everything. I noted my exact time when I entered the closed lane, 3:14 a.m. according to my dashboard clock. I watched the exit signs, the surrounding buildings, the other vehicles, and within a minute of staying in that lane, the wrongness started appearing. Exit signs for streets that don't exist. Buildings that almost matched West LA's skyline, but with wrong details. Vehicles that looked almost normal, but weren't quite right. I drove for 20 minutes in the closed lane that time, going well past Sunset, all the way up to the 101 interchange. The wrong Los Angeles continued the entire way, consistent in its wrongness, never reverting to the familiar version. When I finally merged back into the normal lanes just before the 101, everything snapped back instantly. Real exit signs, real buildings, real vehicles with license plates from actual states. I checked my time. 3:47 a.m. I should have reached the 101 by 3:30 at most, even accounting for traffic. I'd lost another 17 minutes, time that had passed on my clock but hadn't registered on my GPS, as if I'd driven through a longer route while the GPS tracked a shorter one. I've been in that closed lane 5 times now over the past 4 months. Each time, the same phenomenon occurs: merge into the closed lane. Los Angeles becomes wrong, stay in the lane and experience a version of the city that's almost but not quite real, merge back, and everything returns to normal with missing time I can't account for. I've started documenting the differences I observe. The exit signs in the wrong Los Angeles follow a different naming pattern. Streets are numbered differently, neighborhoods have unfamiliar names. The overall grid seems to be based on a different organizational principle. The buildings are similar in style to real LA architecture, but arranged according to different urban planning decisions, as if this city developed from the same starting point, but made different choices about growth and construction. The vehicles bother me the most. They're clearly cars and trucks, designed for the same basic purpose as vehicles in our world, but the manufacturers are wrong. I've seen brand badges I don't recognize, model names that don't exist, design languages that suggest automotive evolution that went in different directions from what actually happened. And the license plates, I've gotten close enough to some vehicles to read the state abbreviations, and they're not from any US state, not from any state that exists in our version of America. I've tried to find information about the closed lane, contacted Caltrans to ask about the ongoing maintenance project. They have no record of any work being done in that section, no permits filed, no projects scheduled. According to official records, That lane shouldn't be closed at all. But it is, every night, coned off and inaccessible to normal traffic. I've talked to other truckers who run the same route, asking if they've noticed the closed lane or tried driving in it. Most of them just shrug it off. They've seen it, assume it's construction, never think about it. But one driver, a guy named Marcus who's been running LA routes for 20 years, pulled me aside when I brought it up. "Don't drive in that lane," he said. "It doesn't go where you think it goes." I drove it once, about 10 years ago, stayed in it too long. When I merged back, I was 3 hours ahead of schedule, but I couldn't remember driving those 3 hours. Just lost time, gone, like I'd been somewhere else doing something else but had no memory of it. He told me he knew 2 other drivers who'd experienced similar things, both of them losing time they couldn't account for, both of them emerging from the closed lane disoriented and confused about where they'd been. "That lane connects to something else," Marcus said. "Some other version of the 405, maybe some other version of LA. And the longer you stay in it, the harder it is to get back, and the more time you lose when you do." I asked him if he'd reported it to anyone, tried to investigate or understand what was happening. He shook his head. "Who would believe it? And what would you even report? That a closed lane on the 405 leads to an alternate reality. They'd think you were insane or on drugs. Better to just avoid it, stay in the normal lanes. Don't think too hard about why that lane is closed every night." But I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop wondering what that wrong version of Los Angeles is, where it comes from, why it's accessible through a closed freeway lane. I've started taking that route more frequently, timing my drive specifically to go through that section between midnight and 5 a.m., sometimes merging into the closed lane, sometimes staying in the normal lanes to compare the experiences. The time loss is getting worse. The first time I lost 15 minutes. The second time, 17 minutes. By my 5th trip into the closed lane, I lost over half an hour, emerging from a 20-minute drive to find that 50 minutes had passed on my clock, while my GPS showed only the expected 20 minutes of travel. And I've started noticing that the wrong Los Angeles is bleeding into the normal version. Little things at first: an exit sign that looks slightly off, a building that seems positioned wrong, a vehicle with an unfamiliar badge. These anomalies appear even when I'm not in the closed lane, as if exposure to that other version is making me more aware of the boundaries between realities, more sensitive to places where they overlap or merge. Last week I was driving the normal lanes, nowhere near the closed section, and I passed an exit for a street called Carson Boulevard. Carson Boulevard doesn't exist in Los Angeles. It's one of the streets I've seen repeatedly in the wrong version, a major thoroughfare that appears on exit signs in that other LA, but not in ours. But there it was, on an official-looking exit sign, positioned where Pico Boulevard should be. I took the exit, following Carson Boulevard into what should have been Mid-Wilshire. The streets were familiar in their general layout, but wrong in their details, the same grid pattern LA uses. But the buildings were different. The businesses had unfamiliar names. The traffic signals were positioned slightly off from where they should be. I drove for 10 minutes through this wrong neighborhood before turning around and getting back on the freeway. And when I did, Carson Boulevard was gone and Pico was back, and the neighborhood I'd been driving through had returned to the normal version. I think the closed lane is a threshold, a connection point between our Los Angeles and another version that exists parallel to it. And I think the more you use that threshold, the more you expose yourself to the other version, the more the boundaries blur, and the easier it becomes to slip between them accidentally. I'm writing this because I'm afraid I'm losing the ability to distinguish between the two versions. I'm afraid that one night I'll merge into that closed lane and won't be able to find my way back. We'll keep driving through the wrong Los Angeles until I'm so far from our version that the normal lanes no longer exist, until I'm permanently trapped in a city that's almost home but fundamentally, terribly wrong. The leftmost lane of the 405 between the 10 and Sunset is closed every night. The cones and barrels are placed there for a reason, though not the reason Caltrans would give if they acknowledge the closure at all. They're there to keep people from accidentally driving into another version of Los Angeles, from slipping between realities through a freeway lane that connects to somewhere else. But some of us drive it anyway. Some of us merge into that closed lane and experience the wrong city, and lose time we can't account for, and slowly start to see the other version bleeding into ours, until we're not sure which Los Angeles we're actually living in. I still drive that route. I still see the closed lane. And sometimes, despite everything I know, Despite all the warnings, I merge into it. Because part of me needs to understand what that other Los Angeles is, where it came from, why it's accessible through a freeway lane that officially doesn't exist. And part of me is terrified that one night I'll merge into that lane and the normal lanes will be gone, and I'll be trapped in the wrong Los Angeles forever, driving through a city that's almost but not quite home, watching exit signs for streets that don't exist in the world I came from, sharing the road with vehicles that were never manufactured in factories I've heard of, until I forget there was ever another version, until the wrong city becomes the only city I know. The lane is closed. It's always closed, every night, for reasons no one will officially acknowledge. And the closure is there for a reason. Some thresholds aren't meant to be crossed, some connections aren't meant to be explored, but the lane is there, and it leads somewhere, and some of us can't resist finding out where. There's a lighthouse on Catalina Island that appears on historical maps, but that no one on the island admits exists, and I've hiked to it, and the light it projects isn't warning ships, it's signaling something in the deeper ocean. I was researching California lighthouses for a maritime history book I'd been commissioned to write, spending months combing through archives, visiting sites, documenting the network of beacons that have guided ships along the California coast for over a century. Lighthouses have always fascinated me. The isolation, the dedication required of keepers, the critical role they played in navigation before modern technology made them largely obsolete. I found the first reference to the Catalina Lighthouse in a 1955 nautical chart at the Huntington Library's Maritime Collection. It was marked on the northwest coast of Catalina Island, a location I knew well from visiting the island multiple times. The chart showed it as an active lighthouse, included in the list of navigational aids for the San Pedro Channel, identified as Catalina Point Light, established 1924. I made a note to visit it during my next research trip to the island. When I started looking for more information about this lighthouse, I encountered something strange. There was almost nothing in the official records. The Coast Guard's historical documentation of California lighthouses made no mention of a beacon at that location. The Catalina Island Museum had no information about a lighthouse on the northwest coast. The California Lighthouse Society's comprehensive database included no entry for Catalina Point Light. I found scattered references in old documents, a 1,932 shipping guide that listed it among active lights, a 1,947 maintenance report that mentioned routine service, a 1,963 budget document that included it in a list of stations scheduled for automation. But after 1968, all references disappeared. No decommissioning notice, no transfer of property, no documentation of the light being extinguished. It simply vanished from official records as if it had never existed. I contacted people who'd lived on Catalina for decades, island historians, retired Coast Guard personnel who'd served in the area. Everyone gave me the same answer: there had never been a lighthouse on the northwest coast. Some of them looked at me like I was confused, suggesting I was thinking of the Point Vicente light on the mainland, or misreading the old charts. But I had clear documentation showing a lighthouse at that specific location, marked on multiple maps from different years. I decided to go see for myself. I took the ferry to Avalon and hired a boat to approach the northwest coast, an area that's largely inaccessible by land, rocky and steep, with no trails or development. The boat captain was skeptical about my request to view the lighthouse site, insisting there was no lighthouse there, but he agreed to take me to the coordinates I'd pulled from the 1,955 chart. As we approached the rocky coastline, I saw it a lighthouse, exactly where the charts indicated, a standard 1920s design with brick construction painted white, maybe 40 feet tall, positioned on a rocky promontory overlooking the channel. The captain saw it too, and his reaction told me everything I needed to know about why no one acknowledged its existence. His face went pale, and he wouldn't bring the boat any closer, dropping me off at a rocky beach about half a mile away, and telling me he'd wait there for 2 hours, but no longer. I hiked toward the lighthouse over difficult terrain, steep slopes covered in scrub vegetation, loose rocks making every step treacherous. There was no trail, no sign that anyone regularly accessed this location, but the lighthouse stood clear and solid above me, the light rotating in its housing, very much functional, despite supposedly being decommissioned over 50 years ago. The climb took me 40 minutes, and when I finally reached the lighthouse, I was struck by how well maintained it appeared. The paint was fresh, the brass fittings polished, the glass in the lantern room clean and clear. This wasn't an abandoned structure, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. This was an actively maintained facility. The door was unlocked. I called out, announcing my presence, but got no response. I entered into a small keeper's room, finding it furnished with basic equipment, a desk, a chair, shelving with supplies. Everything was clean, organized, recently used. On the desk was a logbook, the kind lighthouse keepers historically used to document daily operations, weather conditions, and maintenance activities. I opened the logbook to the most recent entry, dated 3 days ago. The handwriting was neat and precise, recording weather conditions, noting that the light mechanism had been serviced and was operating normally. But there was no signature, no keeper's name, no indication of who was maintaining this lighthouse or why. I flipped back through the logbook, finding entries dating back months, then years, a continuous record of maintenance and observation going back to 2015, when the current logbook had apparently been started. Every entry documented routine lighthouse operations, light functioning, weather recorded, equipment maintained. But every entry was unsigned, and the handwriting varied slightly from entry to entry, as if multiple people were keeping the log, but none of them wanted to identify themselves. I climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room, where the light mechanism was housed. It was a modern automated system, electric rather than the oil lamps that would have been used when the lighthouse was built, but designed to fit within the historical structure. The light was rotating, its beam sweeping across the ocean in a pattern that immediately struck me as wrong. Lighthouse lights follow regular, predictable patterns, specific intervals between flashes that ships can identify and use for navigation. Each lighthouse has its own unique pattern, documented in navigation guides, allowing mariners to determine their location by observing the light's characteristics. But this light wasn't following any standard pattern. The intervals between flashes were irregular, complex, varying in ways that seemed deliberate, but that didn't match any navigational code I knew. It was almost like Morse code, short flashes and long flashes in varying combinations, but when I tried to decode it as Morse, it produced nonsense, letters and symbols that didn't form any recognizable language. And the light was aimed wrong. Standard lighthouse beacons sweep across the horizon, warning ships of dangerous coastline, helping them determine their position relative to land. This light was aimed low, pointing down at a steep angle toward the ocean, as if it were illuminating something in the water, rather than warning ships away from the shore. I watched the pattern for over an hour, trying to find any regularity or meaning in the complex sequence of flashes. I recorded video on my phone, documenting the pattern, thinking I could analyze it later, maybe find someone who could decode what I was seeing. The light continued its strange sequence, flashing in that irregular pattern, aimed at the ocean rather than across it. As the sun set and natural light faded, I realized I needed to head back to meet the boat captain. I took photographs of everything: the exterior, the interior, the logbook entries, the light mechanism, and started the difficult hike back down to the beach. The captain was waiting, clearly anxious to leave. As we pulled away from the coast, I looked back at the lighthouse, now clearly visible in the gathering darkness, its strange light pattern flashing out over the ocean. "How long has that lighthouse been there?" I asked the captain. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "It's always been there, since before I started working these waters 30 years ago. But we don't talk about it, don't acknowledge it. The island authorities don't want tourists trying to access it. The terrain is too dangerous, the hike too risky. So officially, it doesn't exist. No lighthouse on the northwest coast, never has been." I asked him if he knew who maintained it, who kept the light functioning. He shook his head. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. Some things on this island are better left alone. That lighthouse is one of them." Over the next 2 months, I became obsessed with understanding what I'd found. I returned to the island 5 more times, hiring different boat captains, making the difficult hike to the lighthouse, documenting everything I could. The logbook continued to be updated regularly, new entries appearing every few days, all unsigned, all maintaining the pretense of routine lighthouse operations. But I started paying more attention to the light pattern itself, recording hours of video, trying to decode the sequence. I consulted with cryptographers, showed the patterns to experts in maritime signaling, Even contacted military personnel who might recognize classified communication codes. No one could identify the pattern or explain its purpose. On my fourth visit, I stayed at the lighthouse after dark, watching the light operate through the night. Around 2 a.m., I saw something that made my blood run cold. Far out in the ocean, in the deep water of the San Pedro Channel, I saw lights responding. Not surface lights from ships or boats, but lights from deep underwater, glowing with a cold blue-green luminescence, flashing in the same complex pattern the lighthouse was transmitting. I watched for over an hour as the lighthouse sent its signals and the underwater lights responded, a conversation taking place in a code I couldn't understand, between the lighthouse and something in the deep ocean. The underwater lights were far below the surface, deeper than any submarine would operate, flashing from depths that should have been completely dark and empty. I documented everything with video and still photographs, though the distant underwater lights were barely visible in my recordings, just faint glows in the darkness. But they were there, responding to the lighthouse signals, communicating with whatever or whoever was operating the beacon. On my most recent visit, 2 weeks ago, I found new equipment in the lighthouse recording devices, what looked like hydrophones for monitoring underwater sounds, data storage systems that were clearly modern and recently installed. Someone was not just maintaining the light, but actively monitoring the responses from the ocean, documenting the communication that was taking place. I checked the logbook and found a new type of entry, starting about 3 months ago. In addition to the routine maintenance notes, there were now data entries, coordinates, times, signal strengths, notation about contact events, and response patterns. Whoever was keeping the log was systematically documenting the communication between the lighthouse and whatever was in the deep ocean. I tried to access the data storage systems, but they were password protected, encrypted in ways that suggested professional security measures. This wasn't amateur equipment or casual observation. This was a serious, organized effort to maintain communication with something in the San Pedro Channel. I've started researching the history of the San Pedro Channel more carefully, looking for any unusual events or phenomena associated with that area. The channel is deep, over 3,000 feet in some places, and the waters are known for unusual acoustic properties. Underwater currents that can carry sound for long distances, occasional reports from fishermen of strange lights or sounds in the deep water. I found one particularly disturbing historical account from 1947, a Navy report about unusual sonar contacts in the channel during training exercises. The report described objects detected at extreme depths, moving in ways that didn't match any known marine life or submarine technology, appearing and disappearing from sonar in patterns that suggested intelligence and intention. The report was marked unexplained and apparently filed away without further investigation. I found another account from 1963, a fishing vessel captain's report of lights in the deep water, blue-green glows that appeared to respond to the vessel's lights, following the boat for several hours before descending into depths the sonar couldn't reach. The Coast Guard had investigated and found nothing, attributed the sighting to bioluminescent organisms or unusual light refraction. But I think the lighthouse has been signaling to whatever creates those lights for decades, maintaining contact with something in the deep ocean that the authorities either don't know about or have decided to ignore. I think someone, whether it's a government agency, a private research group, or individuals acting independently, has been operating that lighthouse continuously since at least 1924, keeping up the communication even as the facility was officially decommissioned and erased from public records. I've tried to find out who owns the lighthouse now, who has legal authority over that land, but the property records for that section of Catalina's northwest coast are strangely vague, ownership buried under layers of trusts and shell companies that lead nowhere. Someone has gone to considerable effort to hide who controls that lighthouse and who's maintaining it. Last week, I received an email from an account I didn't recognize. No text, just an attachment, a photograph of me at the lighthouse, taken from inside the lantern room, showing me examining the light mechanism. Someone had been there while I was there, watching me, documenting my presence. The message was clear: I was being monitored, my visits noted, my investigation tracked. I haven't been back to the lighthouse since receiving that email. I'm writing this as documentation of what I've found, what I've observed, in case something happens to me, or in case I decide the risks of continuing this investigation are too high. I have hours of video showing the strange light patterns, photographs of the logbooks, recordings of the underwater lights responding to the signals. I believe there's something in the San Pedro Channel, something at depths beyond where humans normally operate, something that has been in communication with that lighthouse for decades. I believe someone has been maintaining that communication deliberately, keeping the lighthouse operational even while denying its existence, hiding the facility from public knowledge, while continuing whatever dialogue or exchange is happening between the light and the deep ocean. I don't know if what's down there is natural or artificial, human or something else. I don't know if the communication is scientific research, military surveillance, or something else entirely. But I know the lighthouse exists. I know it's signaling into the deep ocean, and I know something down there is responding. The lighthouse is still there, still flashing its complex patterns into the night, still receiving responses from the depths of the San Pedro Channel. And someone is still maintaining it, still updating the logbooks, still monitoring the communication between the light and whatever lives in the deep water where sunlight never reaches, and the pressure would crush any vessel humans have built. I think about that lighthouse constantly, about the lonely light on the rocky promontory sending its signals into the ocean darkness, about the cold blue-green lights flashing back from impossible depths. And I wonder what they're saying to each other, what information is being exchanged in a code no one will explain, between a lighthouse that officially doesn't exist and something in the ocean that we're not supposed to know about. The light is still flashing, the signals continue. And deep in the San Pedro Channel, something is still responding, still communicating, still maintaining contact through a lighthouse that appears on old maps, but that everyone claims was never there. Everyone knows the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose has staircases to nowhere and doors that open into walls. But there are rooms in that house that aren't on any tour, aren't in any documentation, and that exist in spaces the house's dimensions don't allow for. I've worked as a tour guide at the Winchester Mystery House for 3 years, and I found 7 rooms that shouldn't exist, and I'm starting to think Sarah Winchester was right about the house having intentions of its own. The Winchester Mystery House is famous for its architectural oddities, the result of Sarah Winchester's obsessive, decades-long construction project that lasted from 1884 until her death in 1922. The story goes that a medium told her she was haunted by spirits killed by Winchester rifles, and that she needed to continuously build onto her house to confuse and appease these spirits. The result is a sprawling Victorian mansion with 160 rooms, staircases that lead to ceilings, doors that open into walls, windows that look into other rooms, and a floor plan so confusing that even staff members sometimes get turned around. I'd been working there about 4 months when I found the first room. I was leading my usual afternoon tour, taking a group through the second floor, following the established route that we guides know by heart. There's a hallway we pass through that has several doors. Some of them are part of the tour. Some lead to storage or maintenance areas that are off limits to visitors. One door in particular I'd passed hundreds of times, always assumed it was a closet or utility space, always found it locked on the rare occasions I'd tried the handle. But on a Tuesday in September, leading a group through that hallway, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My group was focused on a staircase to nowhere that I was explaining, so I quietly tried the handle while talking, planning to close it properly. The door swung open into a fully furnished bedroom I'd never seen before. I kept talking to the group, maintaining my tour guide patter, but my mind was racing. This room wasn't on any floor plan I'd studied. It wasn't part of the public tour, wasn't mentioned in staff training, wasn't in any of the documentation about the house's layout, but it was clearly a Victorian-era bedroom, completely furnished with a bed, dresser, chairs, a vanity, all in period-appropriate style. I guided my tour group to the next stop and then, as soon as I'd finished that tour, went back to the hallway alone. The door was still open. I stepped inside carefully, documenting everything with my phone's camera. The room was pristine, no dust, no signs of age or neglect, as if it had been maintained and cleaned regularly, despite the house being a museum where most areas showed their century of age. But the furniture arrangement was wrong. The bed was positioned facing a blank wall, not toward the door or window as would be normal. The dresser was placed directly in front of the room's only window, blocking the light and the view. The chairs were arranged in a tight circle in the middle of the room, all facing inward toward an empty center point, as if positioned for a seance or meeting but with no table or focal point. I explored the room thoroughly, opening drawers, checking closets, looking for any indication of what this space was or why it existed. In the top drawer of the dresser, I found pages that appeared to be from a journal, written in elegant Victorian handwriting. The entries were dated from the early 1900s and were signed S.W., Sarah Winchester's initials. The pages described Sarah's growing fear that the house was building itself, adding rooms beyond her instructions, creating spaces she hadn't designed. She wrote about finding unfamiliar rooms during her nighttime walks through the mansion, about hearing construction sounds when no workers were present, about the house expanding in directions that violated its architectural plans. I took photographs of the journal pages and left the room, closing the door behind me. When I returned the next day, planning to document the room more thoroughly and report my discovery to the museum's management, the door led to a normal linen closet, narrow and shallow, containing shelves with old linens and cleaning supplies. The bedroom was gone. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Maybe I'd been disoriented, had opened a different door, had confused the layout in a house famous for its confusing architecture. But I had photographs on my phone, except when I checked them, they showed only the linen closet, the normal shelves and supplies, no sign of the furnished bedroom I documented. Over the following months, it happened 6 more times. Always unexpected, always through different doors, always revealing rooms that shouldn't exist according to the house's documented floor plan. Each time, the room would appear for a brief period, sometimes just a few minutes, sometimes for hours, before reverting to whatever normal space the door usually led to. The second room I found was in the basement level, behind a door that normally opened to a maintenance area. Instead, I found a Victorian parlor, expensively furnished with items that looked like they belonged in the main house, but that I'd never seen in any inventory. The room had mirrors on 3 walls, but the reflections were wrong. They showed the room from angles that didn't match the mirror's actual positions, as if they were reflecting a different version of the space. The third room appeared on the 3rd floor, accessible through a door that usually led to a narrow storage closet. This room was smaller, more intimate, set up as a study or writing room. On the desk, I found more journal pages from Sarah Winchester. These ones dated from 1918, describing her terror that the spirits weren't just haunting the house, but were actively participating in its construction, adding rooms to accommodate their needs, rather than being confused or appeased by the chaotic layout. The 4th room violated the house's physical dimensions in a way that made my head hurt to think about. I found it on the 2nd floor, opening a door that should have led to an exterior wall. Instead, there was a full-size bedroom extending into space where, according to the building's footprint, there should have been nothing but open air. I looked out the room's window and saw the garden below from an angle that was impossible given the house's actual structure. The window overlooked an area that should have been on the opposite side of the building. The 5th room appeared in an attic space, furnished as a nursery that Sarah Winchester had never had cause to create, since her only child had died in infancy before the house was even purchased. The room was arranged with care and obvious affection, but the proportions were slightly off. The crib was too small, the rocking chair too large, the toy chest positioned at an angle that blocked the only entrance. And in a drawer, more journal entries, these from 1920, Sarah's handwriting becoming more erratic, describing her realization that the house wasn't just expanding randomly, but was creating specific spaces for specific purposes she couldn't understand. The 6th room I found was the most disturbing. It was a bedroom identical to Sarah Winchester's actual bedroom, which is part of the public tour. But this duplicate bedroom existed on a floor where it couldn't fit according to the building's layout, and it showed Sarah's room not as it appeared in 1922 when she died, but as it appeared right now, Victorian furnishings mixed with modern museum exhibits, ropes and barriers for tourists, informational plaques about the room's history. The duplicate bedroom was showing Sarah's actual bedroom in real time, a mirror or window into another part of the house, existing in a space that violated all architectural logic. The 7th room appeared 3 weeks ago, and it's the one that terrified me enough that I'm writing this down, documenting what I found before something happens to prevent me from telling anyone. I found it through a door on the 1st floor that I'd never seen unlocked before. Inside was a simple bedroom, Victorian furnishings in the Winchester house's typical style, but with one crucial difference: on the bedside table was a journal entry dated from last week. written in handwriting that matched the historical samples of Sarah Winchester's writing I'd studied. The entry described the discovery of a new room by a young woman who guides visitors through my house, who has begun to see what I saw, to understand what I learned too late. It described this guide clearly referring to me finding 7 rooms, examining them, photographing them, slowly understanding that the house has never stopped building itself, never stopped expanding into spaces that don't exist in normal geometry. The entry ended with a warning. The house takes what it needs to continue growing. It took my fortune, my time, my sanity, my life. Now it will take hers, because she has seen too much, understood too much, and the house cannot allow her to leave with that knowledge. I tried to leave work immediately after finding that room, but I became disoriented in hallways I'd walked thousands of times. The house's layout seemed to have changed, familiar routes leading to unfamiliar spaces, doors I'd used countless times now opening into rooms I'd never seen. It took me over an hour to find my way out, and I only managed it by following a tour group who somehow navigated successfully to the exit. Since then, I've noticed the house changing more frequently. Doors that should lead to familiar rooms now sometimes open into the mysterious furnished spaces that shouldn't exist. I'll be conducting a tour and open a door to show visitors a expected room, only to find one of the impossible chambers instead. I've learned to quickly close such doors and redirect the tour group, explaining that the room is closed for maintenance, hoping none of them noticed anything wrong. The journal entries I've found across all 7 rooms tell a consistent story. Sarah Winchester believed the house was alive in some way, that it had developed its own will and purpose beyond her initial intentions. She wrote that the spirits she'd been trying to confuse weren't being confused at all. They were collaborating with the house, helping it grow in directions that served their needs rather than hers. She described finding rooms she hadn't commissioned, hallways that appeared overnight, doors that led to spaces that mathematically couldn't fit within the building's footprint. In her later entries, she stopped fighting the house's expansion. She wrote about accepting that the construction would continue with or without her direction, that the house had become something beyond her control, that the best she could hope for was to coexist with whatever intelligence or force was shaping the structure's growth. The final entry I found, the one dated from last week in handwriting, that shouldn't exist because Sarah Winchester died in 1922, suggested that the house's influence doesn't end with death. It suggested that Sarah herself might still be here in some form, still aware of the house's continued growth, still documenting its expansion in journals left in impossible rooms for people like me to find. I've tried to quit my job at the Winchester house, but every time I submit my resignation, it's somehow never processed. My manager claims he never received it, the HR department has no record of it, and my employment continues despite my repeated attempts to leave. I've tried simply not showing up for shifts, but I find myself driving to the house anyway, walking through its entrance, conducting tours as if I'd never decided to quit. I think the house won't let me leave. I've seen too much, found too many of its secret rooms, read too many journal entries describing its true nature. Like Sarah Winchester before me, I've become part of the house's story, trapped in a structure that continues to build itself according to purposes I can't understand. The rooms keep appearing. I found an 8th one yesterday, a library filled with books in languages I don't recognize, with a journal entry describing how the house now spans multiple realities, existing simultaneously in different versions of San Jose, different timelines, different dimensions. The entry was dated tomorrow, written in handwriting that's starting to look like my own. I think the house is preparing a room for me, a space I'll occupy permanently, where I'll continue to exist long after I should have left, where I'll write journal entries in Victorian handwriting about the house's continued expansion, leaving them for the next tour guide who starts to notice the doors that lead to impossible spaces. The Winchester Mystery House never stopped being built. Sarah Winchester died, but the construction continued, invisible to most visitors, hidden behind doors that appear and disappear, creating rooms and spaces that don't exist according to normal geometry. And the house is still growing, still expanding, still taking what it needs: fortunes, time, sanity, lives to fuel its eternal, impossible construction. I'm writing this in my apartment, but I can hear sounds through the walls that shouldn't be there: hammering, sawing, the sounds of construction happening in adjacent spaces that don't exist. I think the house is building around me, even here, expanding beyond its physical location in San Jose, creating rooms in my apartment, in my life, preparing space for me to occupy when I finally stop resisting and accept what Sarah Winchester learned a century ago. The house never stops building. And once you've seen its secret rooms, once you've read the journals and understood its true nature, you become part of the construction, materials for its endless expansion, another soul trapped in the Winchester Mystery House's impossible architecture. There are rooms that aren't on any tour, rooms that exist in spaces the house's dimensions don't allow for. I've found 7 of them. Soon I'll find the 8th, the one being built for me, the one I'll occupy forever, writing journal entries in handwriting that will slowly become indistinguishable from Sarah Winchester's, leaving warnings for the next person who notices that certain doors in the Winchester house lead to places they shouldn't, rooms that expand the building beyond the boundaries of space and time and sanity. The house is still building. It's been building for over a century, and it will continue building long after everyone who knew Sarah Winchester has died, long after the tours have stopped and the museum is closed, long after the physical structure has crumbled, because the house doesn't exist entirely in our world anymore. It exists in multiple spaces simultaneously, growing in directions we can't perceive, creating rooms for occupants who aren't entirely alive but aren't entirely dead either. I can see it now, the room that's being prepared for me. I can see it through doorways that shouldn't exist, in reflections that show impossible angles, in dreams that aren't quite dreams. And I know that soon I'll stop writing these warnings and start writing journal entries, leaving them in rooms that appear and disappear, documenting the house's continued growth for whoever comes after me. Whoever is unlucky enough to notice the doors that lead to nowhere or everywhere in the Winchester Mystery House that never stops expanding, never stops building, never stops taking what it needs to continue its impossible, eternal construction.